If you close your eyes and listen to the wind moving through the ancient pines, you can almost hear the quiet scratching of a pen against paper in the autumn chill. Long before the iron and the fire came to the deep woods, there was only the forest itself. It was a place older than memory, a sprawling ocean of dark green firs and ancient, twisting oaks, their roots woven deep into the cool, damp earth of the borderlands. As autumn began to paint the edges of the broad leaves in soft hues of amber, rust, and pale gold, a profound stillness settled over the forest floor. The light here was always filtered, always gentle, breaking through the dense canopy in pale, dusty shafts that illuminated dancing specks of pollen and pine dust. To step into the forest was to step into a grand, quiet cathedral of nature, where the outside world, with all its loud, angry noises, simply faded away. For the young men sent to stand guard beneath these towering giants, the forest offered something they had not felt in a very long time. It offered the beautiful, fragile illusion of safety. The uniform felt heavy, thick wool smelling of distant wood smoke and rain, but beneath it, the boy inside was still so very young. We will call him Johannes. He sat on a fallen log, its bark softened by a thick, velvety blanket of emerald moss. The air was crisp, carrying the sharp, clean scent of pine needles and turning earth. Every breath he took plumed into a little white cloud that drifted up, hanging for a moment in the still air before vanishing into the branches above. It was so quiet. So incredibly, deeply quiet. Back home, there were the sounds of the restless city, the rumble of carts, the hurried footsteps on cobblestones, the anxious murmurs of a world turned upside down. But here, tucked away deep within the shadowed folds of the woods, there was only the gentle sigh of the wind rocking the treetops, and the occasional snap of a dry twig as a deer moved carefully through the underbrush. For Johannes, and for so many others wrapped in their oversized gray coats, this silence was a balm to their weary souls. They had walked for miles, carrying the heavy burden of duty, their shoulders aching, their boots worn thin against the rough roads. And yet, arriving in this shadowed sanctuary, the conflict suddenly felt like a distant rumor. It felt as though they had walked entirely off the map, into a quiet fairy tale wood where no harm could ever find them. Johannes rested a small, battered notebook on his knee. His fingers, red and stiff from the morning chill, clumsily held a small stub of a pencil. He was writing a letter to his younger sister. He didn't write about the long march. He didn't write about the cold nights or the gnawing ache of homesickness. Instead, he wrote to her about the birds. He wrote about a tiny brown wren that had landed on the toe of his boot earlier that morning, tilting its little head and looking at him with bright, curious eyes before fluttering away into the sea of ferns. He described the way the autumn light caught the morning dew, turning the forest floor into a carpet of scattered diamonds. "It is peaceful here, little bird," he wrote, using his childhood nickname for her. "The trees are so tall they seem to touch the very sky, and they stand around us like quiet giants, keeping the bad things away. You would love the smell of it. It smells like the holidays, like pine wreaths and wood fires, like the deep forest behind grandfather's house." In writing these words, Johannes was not just soothing his sister, he was soothing himself. He was building a shelter out of ink and paper, a tiny, warm room of memory and hope where he could retreat when the shadows grew a little too long. He smiled gently as he drew a small, clumsy sketch of a pinecone at the bottom of the page, imagining her smiling when she finally unfolded the paper. He wasn't alone in this quiet coping. Down the line, hidden behind thick curtains of spruce, other young men were finding their own moments of grace. There was a quiet hum of life beneath the canopy, slow and measured. Two men sat leaning against a massive trunk, their shoulders touching for warmth, sharing the last precious crumbs of a sweet biscuit sent from home weeks ago. They didn't speak. There was no need to. The simple, generous act of breaking the biscuit in half, of offering it with a slight nod, spoke volumes. It said, "I am here, and you are here, and we will share what little we have in the quiet." Nearby, an older soldier with kind, tired eyes was carefully mending a tear in a younger boy's jacket. The needle moved rhythmically, a tiny flash of silver in the dappled light. The older man hummed a soft folk tune under his breath, a song about a river and a watermill, and the young boy listened, his eyes half closed, lulled by the familiar melody and the comforting presence of a steady hand. They moved softly, these men in the woods, matching the rhythm of the forest. They learned to speak in low murmurs, not out of necessity, but out of an unconscious reverence for the silence. To shout would be to break the spell. To raise their voices would be to invite the outside world inside. As the afternoon wore on, the golden shafts of light began to recede, drawing back up into the canopy like pulling threads. The air grew noticeably colder, a crisp, clean bite that promised the gentle coming of frost. Johannes blew on his hands to warm them, carefully folding the paper. He tucked the finished letter into the breast pocket of his tunic, right over his heart, and buttoned it tight. The forest was shifting from day to dusk, a slow, beautiful fade into twilight. The greens of the ferns deepened to almost black. The rough trunks of the pines became silhouetted pillars against the fading violet sky. It was in this transitional hour that the forest felt the most mysterious, breathing a slow, rhythmic breath that seemed to match the rising and falling of their own chests. They watched the shadows lengthen, stretching across the moss, reaching out to touch their boots. There was no fear in the dark, not yet. Just a quiet, melancholic acceptance of the night. Someone struck a match, a brief, warm flare of yellow that illuminated a tired, gentle face, before lighting a small, carefully shielded stove. The smell of warming coffee, faint and watery but deeply comforting, mingled with the scent of the pine needles. It was a meager comfort, but in the vastness of the woods, a warm cup in the hands felt like a priceless treasure. Johannes walked over to join his friends. They made room for him on the damp earth without a word, passing the metal tin. The warmth of the cup seeped into his palms, and the warmth of their shared presence seeped into his spirit. They sat together and watched the stars slowly begin to prick through the dense roof of branches. The sentries took their posts, leaning against the rough bark, peering into the growing gloom. They listened. The wind whispered through the needles, a soft, rushing sound, like a mother calming a restless child. Shh. Be still. Rest now. It was so incredibly easy to believe, in that gentle murmuring dark, that the trees were watching over them. That the thick walls of ancient timber and earth were an impenetrable fortress that the world outside simply could not breach. Johannes rested his cheek against his folded arms, pulling his collar up against the chill, leaning into the quiet. His eyelids grew heavy. His thoughts drifted away from the maps and the borders, floating back to a warm kitchen, the smell of baking bread, the sound of a sister's laughter echoing in a hallway. He held on to that feeling, wrapping it around himself like a thick, woolen blanket. And so, they waited in the ancient embrace of the trees. 1,000 quiet hearts beating in the dark. 1,000 letters tucked against chests. 1,000 quiet hopes that the morning would bring only the gentle mist, the song of the birds, and the soft, filtered light of autumn. They did not know what the changing season would bring. They only knew the profound peace of the present moment. The heartbreaking stillness of the forest before the storm. The gentle, rocking sway of the branches high above, singing them a silent lullaby, holding them safe in the deep, dreaming shadows beneath the canopies. Sleep, the forest seemed to whisper to the boys in the gray coats. Sleep, and let the roots hold you. It begins not with a sudden storm, but with a single, freezing drop slipping from a high pine needle to rest quietly upon the gray wool of a tired boy's shoulder. If you listen closely to the woods as the season turns, you can hear the deep, heavy sigh of the earth long before the sky completely falls. The golden, dusty light that once filtered so gently through the ancient trees slowly surrenders to a vast, bruised gray. The heavy clouds do not simply pass over the forest, they descend into it, settling among the high branches like a thick, damp breath. And then, the weeping begins. It is a slow, methodical rain. It does not rage or thunder. It simply falls, hour after hour, a relentless, quiet drumbeat upon millions of turning leaves and swaying pine boughs. For the young men resting in the deep shadows, the first hour of the rain is almost a peaceful thing. The sound is a gentle hush, washing away the silence, wrapping the forest in a veil of white noise. But as the afternoon stretches on, the ancient canopy, thick as it is, can no longer hold the water back. The forest roof breaks. The drops begin to find their way down to the forest floor, heavy and cold. They fall upon the shoulders of the boys in their oversized coats. They tap softly against the rims of their deep steel helmets. They gather on the pale, trembling hands resting on knees drawn close to chests. Let us sit beside a man named Elias. Before this profound quiet wrapped itself around him, he was a baker in a small town where the smell of yeast and warm sugar filled the early morning air. He knows the deep, comforting heat of a brick oven. He knows the feeling of warmth radiating against his skin. But here, leaning back against the rough, wet bark of a towering fir tree, that warmth feels like a dream he had in another lifetime. Elias pulls his collar up around his neck, trying to hide his chin from the creeping chill. He feels the dampness touch the back of his neck, a slow, icy finger tracing its way down his spine. The thick gray wool of his uniform, once a shield against the crisp autumn air, is slowly drinking in the rain. It grows heavy, pulling at his tired shoulders. It smells of wet earth, of damp leaves, and of the deep, old melancholy of the woods. There is no shelter to be found. The trees offer only the illusion of a roof, gathering the mist into larger, heavier drops that fall with a hollow thud. The ground beneath them, the once soft, comforting carpet of rust-colored pine needles, begins to change. The earth drinks the rain until it can hold no more, and then, slowly, the forest floor yields. It turns into a thick, grasping mire. It is a quiet misery. There are no loud complaints, no angry shouts into the gray sky. The boys around Elias simply pull their knees tighter against their chests, lowering their heads, becoming small beneath the weeping heavens. They are learning, in the slow, creeping damp, that the forest is not their protector. The ancient, brooding trees are indifferent to the shivering shoulders beneath them. Nature, which had offered such a beautiful, silent sanctuary just days before, is slowly turning her back on them. Elias watches a young recruit, barely older than his own son, struggling to pull his boot from the deep mud. The earth makes a soft, sucking sound, a weary sigh, as it tries to hold onto the boy's foot. The young man's hands are red and raw, fumbling with the wet leather. He slips, catching himself on a rotting log, his hands sinking into a cold puddle of black water. Elias does not speak, but he reaches out, his own hand shivering, and grasps the boy's elbow. He pulls, gently but firmly, until the boy is steady again. They exchange a glance, a silent, shared acknowledgement of the heavy, cold world they are sinking into. In the dim, watery light of the late afternoon, Elias reaches inside his heavy, soaked coat. His fingers are numb, clumsy and thick, as he unbuttons the breast pocket. He brings out a small, folded piece of paper. It is a letter from home, arriving days ago when the sun still touched the moss. He unfolds it carefully, shielding it with his hunched body, trying to make a tiny, dry tent out of his chest and arms. He wants to read her words again. He needs to remember the sound of her voice, the safety of their small kitchen, the yellow light spilling from their window onto the cobblestones. But the air itself is too heavy with water. The humidity settles on the thin paper. The ink, once neat and precise, begins to bloom. A single drop of water falls from the rim of his helmet, landing softly on her name. He watches, his heart aching with a quiet, hollow sadness, as the blue ink blurs and runs, smudging the letters until they look like the soft shadows of the forest itself. It is as if the autumn sky is weeping onto the page, washing away the fragile connection to the world he left behind. He carefully refolds the damp paper, pressing it back against his chest, holding it close to his heart as if his own fading body heat might dry it, might save it. As evening approaches, the gray light dissolves into a deep, impenetrable black. The rain does not stop. It continues its endless, rhythmic whispering in the dark. The darkness in the wet woods is absolute. You cannot see the rain, you can only feel it finding its way through every seam, every buttonhole, every quiet defense. Two boys sit pressed together under a single piece of canvas tied clumsily between a pair of thin birch trees. The canvas sags under the weight of the water, a heavy belly of rain threatening to spill over them. The drops hit the taut fabric with a steady, monotonous tapping. They sit shoulder to shoulder, pooling their fragile warmth. One of the boys reaches into his rucksack, his movements slow and methodical in the freezing dark. He pulls out a pair of woolen socks. They are not entirely dry, but they are drier than the ones on his freezing feet. He holds them for a moment, feeling the precious, coarse texture. Then, without a word, he nudges the shivering boy next to him and presses one of the socks into his hand. It is a small thing. Just a piece of drywool in an ocean of cold mud. But in the deep, freezing black of the Hürtgen, it is a profound act of love. It is a quiet, heroic defiance against the misery that threatens to swallow them whole. The second boy takes the sock, his trembling fingers brushing against his friend's hand. He whispers a soft word of thanks into the dark, a sound that is instantly swallowed by the gentle rushing of the rain. There is no way to build a fire. The wood is soaked through, smelling of rot and deep earth. Even a match refuses to strike, the sulfur turning to useless paste against the wet striking pad. And so, they must simply sit. They must endure. They close their eyes, letting the sound of the rain wash over them, trying to find a rhythm in the falling drops that might lull them into a shallow, fitful sleep. The forest, once a grand cathedral, feels like a cold, damp cellar. The roots of the great trees pool with icy water. The ferns bow their heads under the weight of the droplets. The quiet sentries lean against the trunks, their rifles heavy and wet in their hands, staring out into a dark mist that hides the world from view. They listen to the wind moving through the wet branches, a sound that no longer resembles a mother's lullaby, but a long, mourning sigh. They dream, when sleep finally comes, not of grand victories or glorious returns. They dream of simple, impossible things. They dream of a dry pair of boots waiting by a glowing hearth. They dream of a heavy woolen blanket pulled up over their ears in a room where the wind cannot reach. They dream of a warm cup of coffee, the steam rising to fog a kitchen window. But as they breathe in the cold, damp air of the night, their chests rising and falling in unison under the dripping canopy, the reality of the forest holds them tight. The mud clings to their boots, binding them to the earth. The wet wool clings to their skin, pulling the heat from their weary bones. The autumn sky continues to weep over the Hürtgen, washing away the last traces of the golden season, leaving behind only the cold, the dark, and the quiet resilience of boys huddled together in the shadows, waiting for a morning that will only bring more of the gray, unending rain. Rest now, if you can, in the damp and the dark. Let the sound of the falling rain carry you away from the chill, away from the mud, to a place where the air is warm and the paper remains crisp and dry. Sleep, as the forest weeps its quiet tears, and hold tight to the small, warm embers of home burning softly in the gentle dark. When the forest breathes out, the world disappears, and only the shadows remain. The heavy rains of the previous days had finally ceased, but they did not leave peace in their wake. Instead, as the damp earth met the cooling autumn air, a thick, pale mist began to rise from the forest floor. It did not roll in like a storm cloud from the sea, rather, it bloomed softly from the ground up. It crawled over the roots, spilled into the trenches, and slowly climbed the rough, wet bark of the ancient fir trees until the canopy itself was swallowed whole. The world, which had already felt so small beneath the towering pines, suddenly shrank to the length of a single outstretched arm. To sit in the Hürtgen Forest on a morning like this was to be wrapped in a dense, freezing cloud. The air turned the color of heavy milk. It was a fog so absolute, so heavy, that it felt as though you could reach out and pull it apart with your bare hands, like unspun wool. It muffled everything. The vast, echoing cathedral of the woods was gone, replaced by a tight, suffocating white room. The horizon vanished. The sky vanished. Even the tree you were leaning against seemed to blur and fade if you simply leaned forward. For the soldiers wrapped in their damp, gray coats, this loss of sight brought a new, profound kind of isolation. When you cannot see the world around you, your ears become your only tether to reality. Every sense shifts, stretching out into the white veil, desperate to understand what lies just beyond the visible. Let us sit quietly beside an older soldier. We will call him Heinrich. Heinrich had seen many seasons change, and his face carried the deep, quiet lines of a man who has learned to wait. He was a veteran, a man who usually moved with a calm, assured rhythm. But today, sitting in a shallow depression scraped from the wet earth, Heinrich was perfectly, rigidly still. His eyes, framed by the cold rim of his steel helmet, stared into the impenetrable white. He blinked away the condensation that gathered on his pale eyelashes, but blinking did not help. There was nothing to see. And so, Heinrich closed his eyes, and he listened. The forest in the fog was not silent. It was alive with 1,000 tiny, deceiving whispers. The heavy droplets of water left behind by the rain were constantly falling from the unseen needles high above. They fell with a soft, rhythmic tink, tink, tink against helmets and shoulders, a sound like a quiet, erratic clock ticking away the hours. There was the soft, wet shifting of the earth settling. The creak of a heavy branch bending under its own damp weight in the invisible canopy. But Heinrich was listening for something else. He was listening for the phantom pressure. They knew the Americans were out there. They had felt them before the fog set in, a slow, relentless pushing at the edges of the woods. But now, the enemy was entirely unseen. They were no longer men, they had become ghosts moving through the white soup. Suddenly, Heinrich's breath caught slowly in his throat. Crack. It was a small sound. The distinct, dry snap of a dead twig breaking under pressure. It came from somewhere to his left, perhaps 50 yards away, perhaps 10. In the fog, distance was a liar. The mist swallowed the origin of the noise, making it seem as though it came from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Heinrich's gloved hands tightened slightly around the cold, damp wood of his rifle. He did not raise it. To move was to make a sound, and to make a sound was to invite the ghosts toward him. He simply sat, barely breathing, his heart beating a slow, heavy drum in his chest. He waited. The forest held its breath with him. Then came the rustle. It was not the wind moving through the ferns. It was the heavy, brushing sound of thick canvas scraping against wet bark. It was the soft, squelching sound of a heavy leather boot pulling free from the deep mud. Squelch. Pause. Squelch. They were moving. Slowly, blindly, just like Heinrich. The tension in the air grew heavy, almost electric. It was a terrible, quiet intimacy. Two opposing forces, separated only by a curtain of white vapor, stumbling through the same freezing mire, sharing the same damp air. A new scent drifted on a slow current of moving mist. It cut through the smell of wet earth and pine resin. It was the faint, sweet smell of a different kind of tobacco. An American cigarette, burning somewhere in the void, carried to Heinrich on the breath of the fog. It was terrifying, and yet, there was a strange, poetic sorrow to it. They were so close. So close that Heinrich could almost hear the rustle of their clothing, the quiet clink of a canteen against a metal buckle. If he reached out into the mist, he felt he might accidentally brush the shoulder of a boy from Ohio or Pennsylvania, a boy who was just as cold, just as lost, and just as frightened by the snapping twigs as he was. No shots were fired. In the deep fog, a rifle flash would be a beacon, giving away the only advantage they had, their invisibility. And so, they fought a war of absolute silence. A war of holding one's breath until the lungs burned. A war of sitting perfectly still while the mind raced with invisible terrors. Beside Heinrich, huddled beneath a heavy, sodden blanket, was a boy no older than 18. The boy was trembling. It was a deep, uncontrollable shivering that came not just from the biting cold, but from the unbearable strain of the unseen. The boy's eyes were wide, darting blindly from left to right, trying to pierce the white veil, terrified of the ghosts that were surely standing right in front of him. He opened his mouth, perhaps to whisper a panicked question, perhaps to cry out. Before he could make a sound, Heinrich moved. Slowly, with infinite gentleness, the older man reached out his hand. He placed his heavy, woolen mitten over the boy's trembling, gloved fingers. He gave a soft, reassuring squeeze. Heinrich leaned in close, until his face was only inches from the boy's ear. He brought with him the smell of damp wool and stale coffee. "Shoo," Heinrich breathed, his voice barely a vibration in the heavy air. "Do not look at the fog, little one. It only plays tricks on the eyes. Look at the ground. Look at the mud between your boots. That is real." The boy swallowed hard, nodding slowly, forcing his gaze downward to the small patch of dark earth between his knees. "It reminds me of the river," Heinrich whispered, his voice smooth and calming, a gentle anchor in the churning sea of white. "Back home, in the late autumn, the river valleys fill with a mist just like this. It rolls off the water before the sun rises. It covers the rooftops of the village, turning all the houses into little islands." Heinrich kept his hand firmly over the boy's, sharing his calm, steadying the younger man's shaking frame. "My wife," Heinrich continued softly, a faint, melancholic smile touching his lips, "she loves the fog. She says it is the world putting a blanket over its head to get a little more sleep. She says it makes everything soft. When I walk to the bakery on those mornings, I cannot see the end of my own street. But I know it is there. I know the bakery is there. I just have to walk slowly, one step at a time, until the smell of the bread finds me." The boy's trembling began to slow. The rhythm of Heinrich's voice, the image of a quiet village morning, of a sleeping town, acted as a balm. It pushed back the ghosts. It built a small, warm wall against the encroaching dread. "They are just like us out there," Heinrich whispered, staring back into the milk. "They cannot see. They are tripping over the roots. They are cold. They are just trying to find their way through the mist, step by step. We will stay still. We will be part of the roots today. We will let them pass like shadows." And so they sat, the old veteran and the young boy, anchored to one another in the blinding white. They listened as the footsteps slowly crunched their way through the brush, fading away, swallowed once again by the immense, muffled silence of the Hürtgen. The phantom pressure eased, just a little, leaving behind the steady tink, tink, tink of the falling water droplets. In the quiet that followed, Heinrich's thoughts drifted back to the village, back to the river valley he had spoken of. He closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the cold earth. He imagined he was sitting on his own porch, wrapped in a heavy quilt, listening to the morning water rush over the stones. He imagined the fog lifting, slowly revealing the warm, golden light of the sun on the cobblestones. He held on to that thought, guarding it like a precious ember. In a place where the eyes were useless, where the world was reduced to white mist and snapping twigs, the mind had to travel far away to find safety. The day stretched on, timeless and gray. There was no sun to track the hours, only a gradual, imperceptible darkening of the mist as late afternoon gave way to evening. The white fog slowly turned to ash, and then to a deep, enveloping charcoal. The cold deepened, settling into their joints, a dull, familiar ache. But they did not move. They remained hidden in their shallow scrapes, quiet sentinels in a forest of ghosts. They learned to sleep with one eye open, with one ear tuned to the rustling dark. They learned the terrible patience of the hunted and the blind. As the night fully claimed the forest, bringing a darkness so thick you could feel it pressing against your face, the fog remained. It wrapped around them all, the old men, the young boys, and the unseen strangers stumbling through the trees just yards away. It held them all in its cold, impartial embrace. Listen to the stillness. Let the soft, muffled quiet wash over you. There is no need to strain your eyes against the dark. There is no need to listen for the breaking branches. Simply breathe in the cool, damp air. Let the heavy blanket of the mist settle over the world, softening the sharp edges, hushing the loud noises, bringing a strange, quiet peace to the hidden corners of the woods. Sleep now, in the shadow of the unseen. Let the world fade into white, and let your mind wander back to the quiet river valleys, to the warm kitchens, and to the soft, gentle light of a morning that is waiting, patiently, just beyond the fog. There is a heaviness to the earth when it has drunk too much rain, a slow and silent pull that wants to draw everything down into the dark. If you walk through a forest after a long, weeping storm, you will notice how the ground has changed. The crisp, brittle leaves of autumn no longer crunch beneath your feet. The bouncy, resilient carpet of moss and pine needles is gone. In the Hürtgen, after the endless gray days of the autumn rains, the forest floor had simply surrendered. It dissolved into a vast, slow-moving ocean of thick, grasping mud. This was not the playful mud of childhood, the kind that splashes and puddles and washes easily away in a warm bath. This was a deep, ancient mire, churned by thousands of boots until it became a heavy, suffocating paste. It was a cold, dark clay that seemed to breathe, sighing and sucking with every step taken. It clung to the heavy leather boots of the young soldiers, adding agonizing pounds of weight to legs that were already trembling with exhaustion. It splashed against the coarse gray wool of their long coats, sinking into the fibers, turning the fabric into a freezing, rigid shell that bound them tight. To move just a few yards felt like wading through a river of setting concrete. And so, the boys learned to stop moving. They learned to sit in the shallow craters and hollows beneath the tangled, exposed roots of the giant oaks, letting the earth rise up around them. The mud held them close, painting their pale faces and raw hands in shades of brown and charcoal, slowly turning them into living extensions of the forest floor. But the earth did more than just hold the boys in place. It swallowed the world outside. Miles away, where the trees thinned and the roads were meant to be made of stone and packed gravel, the supply lines had simply vanished into the earth. The wagons, laden with heavy metal canisters of warm soup, wrapped loaves of bread, and dry woolen blankets, sat motionless, buried to their axles. The great, gentle draft horses, their coats slick with freezing rain, stood with their heads bowed, their sorrowful eyes blinking slowly against the mist. They could not drag the heavy wooden wheels another inch. The forest had closed its doors. It had built an impassable moat of muck and clay, silently shutting out the rest of the world. And inside this dark, dripping fortress, the boys waited. As the days bled into long, shivering nights, and the nights stretched into pale, watery dawns, a new, quiet companion joined the soldiers in their damp hollows. It was not the biting frost, nor the ghostly whispers in the fog. It was a hollow, echoing ache right in the center of their chests. Hunger is a quiet thief. It does not shout or demand. It simply moves in, a slow and steady shadow, stealing the warmth from the fingertips, the focus from the eyes, and the strength from the legs. It leaves behind a fragile, hollow shell. When you are that cold, and that hungry, the mind tries to protect you. It sends you away from the freezing mud and transports you back to the places of light and warmth. Let us sit beside a small group of friends, huddled tight beneath the protective arm of a fallen pine. Let us watch them as they close their eyes and dream. There is Lucas, a boy whose long, delicate fingers used to carve beautiful wooden animals for his little sisters by the fire. He is dreaming of his mother's kitchen. He can almost see the steam rising from a porcelain bowl, the golden broth dotted with fat, the smell of roasted onions and warm parsley wrapping around him like an embrace. Beside him sits Carl, who sang in the church choir on Sunday mornings, his clear voice soaring up into the vaulted ceilings of a distant cathedral. Carl is dreaming of the baker's window in his village, of the neat rows of powdered pastries and the warm, sweet air that would rush out whenever the heavy wooden door was pushed open. And then there is young Peter, leaning his heavy head against Carl's shoulder. Just a year ago, Peter's greatest worry was passing his mathematics examination. Now, he dreams only of a slice of bread, thick and soft, heavily smeared with pale yellow butter, resting on a clean white plate. They do not speak of the hunger. To speak of it is to wake from the dream, to acknowledge the cavernous emptiness in their bellies and the freezing water seeping through their trousers. They simply sit, shoulder to shoulder, cooling their fading body heat, listening to the monotonous dripping of the forest. But then, the quiet rhythm of their rest is broken by a small, delicate sound. Carl is moving. He shifts his weight carefully, his arms moving slowly within the heavy, mud-caked folds of his coat. He reaches deep into the very bottom of his canvas rucksack. His fingers, stiff and pale as marble, fumble in the dark. They brush against something hard, wrapped in a small scrap of waxed paper. He pulls it out, and the crinkle of the paper sounds impossibly loud in the hushed, damp air of the forest. Lucas opens his eyes. Peter lifts his head. It is a single heel of dark rye bread. It is many days old, forgotten in the bottom of the bag, hidden beneath spare socks and brass casings. It is hard as a river stone, its edges sharp, and it is barely larger than the palm of Carl's trembling hand. In another life, in a sunlit dining room with a sweeping broom and a warm stove, this tough, stale end of the loaf would have been tossed out into the garden for the sparrows. It would have been an afterthought. But here, in the dim, watery light of the Hürtgen, wrapped in the endless mud, it is a treasure beyond measure. Carl looks at the bread. His own body is screaming for sustenance. Every instinct, every primitive urge born of starvation and cold, begs him to turn away, to hide the bread beneath his coat, to eat it in secret while the others sleep. It would be so easy. It would take only a moment. But Carl does not turn his back. He holds the small, hard crust out into the center of their small circle, letting the pale gray light fall upon it. He looks at Lucas, tracing the deep, dark hollows under his friend's eyes. He looks at Peter, seeing the pale, translucent quality of the boy's shivering skin. Carl reaches down to his belt. He unclasps his bayonet, the metal cold and heavy. He takes the hem of his coat, the only dry patch remaining near his collar, and carefully wipes the steel blade clean. He presses the sharp edge to the hard, dark crust of the bread. He saws at the small block. It takes effort, a surprising amount of his fading strength, to break through the stale surface. He presses down, his jaw tight, until the bread breaks with a dull, dry snap. He does this again, measuring carefully with his eyes. He divides the tiny treasure into 3 perfectly equal pieces. There is a profound, breathtaking grace in this simple motion. In a world that has been reduced to wet earth, freezing rain, and survival, this small act of division is a towering monument to the human spirit. Carl sets his knife down. He picks up one of the small, jagged pieces, and he presses it gently into Lucas's cold hand. He picks up the second piece, and he presses it into Peter's palm. He keeps the last, identical piece for himself. There is no rush to consume it. There is no desperate, animal tearing at the food. It is a slow, deeply reverent moment. It is a silent communion in the cathedral of the pines. Lucas brings the crumb to his lips. He places it on his tongue and closes his eyes. He does not chew. He lets the dry, rough texture rest in his mouth, allowing his saliva to slowly, gently soften the stale rye. He breathes softly through his nose, searching for the faint, distant ghost of yeast, of salt, of the warm ovens of home. Peter does the same. A single, silent tear escapes the corner of his eye, cutting a clean, pale track through the mud on his cheek, before disappearing into his collar. The bread is not enough to fill their empty stomachs. It is barely enough to give them the energy to shiver against the coming night. It will not save them from the cold, and it will not pull them from the mire. But as the last, soft crumbs dissolve, Peter opens his eyes and looks at Carl. In the shadows of the muddy hollow, the young boy smiles. It is a fragile, heartbreaking smile. It is a smile that speaks a language older than the forest itself. It says, I see you. It says, you see me. It says, we are hungry, and we are freezing, and the earth is trying to swallow us whole, but we are not alone. That single piece of stale bread, broken and shared in the despair of the mud, is a quiet, brilliant light. It is the everyday heroism of a boy choosing to love his brothers more than he loves himself. It is a reminder that even when the world is stripped away, down to the bare roots and the wet clay, kindness remains. The mud holds them close. It stains their hands and their faces, binding them to the earth. But beneath the heavy, wet crust of their uniforms, their hearts still beat in a quiet, synchronized rhythm. They lean their heavy heads against one another once more, forming a small, inseparable knot of humanity in the vast and different wilderness. Let the image of that shared crust of bread warm you. Let the quiet grace of those three boys sit gently in your mind. The world outside may be cold, and the earth may feel heavy, but there is always a light to be found in the quiet sacrifices of a friend. Close your eyes and feel the gentle, rhythmic breathing of the forest. Let the dark, rich scent of the damp earth soothe you into rest. Sleep now, knowing that even in the deepest shadows, the human heart finds a way to share its warmth. Rest, and let the quiet night hold you close. To escape the endless weeping of the forest sky, the boys buried themselves in the cold earth, only to find that the concrete breathed a heavy, damp sigh of its own. Beneath the towering, ruined pines and the deep, impassable oceans of mud, there lay a hidden world of stone and steel. These were the pillboxes, the buried fortresses constructed long before the first autumn leaf had fallen. From the outside, they were mere mounds of earth, hidden beneath nets and branches, swallowed by the roots of the ancient woods. But to step through the heavy, groaning iron doors and descend the short flight of concrete stairs was to step into another universe entirely. When the heavy steel doors clanged shut, pulling closed with a dull, final thud, the sounds of the forest were instantly severed. The rushing wind, the endless tapping of the rain, the distant, muffled thuds that shook the treetops, all of it vanished, replaced by an absolute, suffocating stillness. It was as if the boys had walked into the belly of a sleeping stone giant. The air down here was profoundly different. It was still, completely motionless, and heavy with the gathered breath of 24 exhausted men. There was no breeze to carry away the smells of the war, and so the air grew thick with a rich, human scent. It smelled of damp, unwashed wool slowly warming against shivering skin. It smelled of wet leather boots, of stale tobacco rolled in trembling fingers, and the faint, metallic tang of rifle oil. Above it all, cutting through the heavy musk, was the sharp, clean scent of iodine and carbolic soap. In the center of this curved, low-ceilinged room sat a young man named Matthias. Matthias was not a soldier who carried a rifle into the mist. He carried a small, worn leather satchel, its strap frayed from constant use. He was the medic, the quiet caretaker of this buried flock. In the dim, flickering amber glow of a single shielded kerosene lantern, Matthias's face looked impossibly gentle. The light danced across the damp, curving walls of the bunker, catching the beads of condensation that gathered on the cold ceiling like thousands of tiny, glowing pearls. Every now and then, a single drop of water would gather enough weight to fall from the concrete ceiling, landing with a soft plop onto a heavy woolen blanket or a muddy helmet. It was the only way the bunker kept time. The space was terribly small. The boys were packed together, shoulder to shoulder, sitting on wooden benches or huddled on the cold floor with their knees pulled tight to their chests. It was a claustrophobic existence. The thick walls, designed to keep the danger out, also kept the fears locked safely inside. You could not stretch your legs without brushing against a neighbor. You could not sigh without the man beside you feeling the breath on his cheek. There were prisoners of the concrete, locked away in the dark to wait out the storm above. But in this cramped, dimly lit cave, Matthias moved with a slow, deliberate grace that brought a profound sense of peace to the crowded room. He was not performing grand, dramatic surgeries. The boys who came to him in the bunker brought him the small, quiet agonies of the forest. They brought him hands raw and blistered from digging in the frozen mud. They brought him deep, aching splinters from the shattered trees. They brought him feet that had not been dry in weeks, pale and wrinkled and numb with the creeping cold. Matthias sat on an overturned wooden crate, a small, clean towel spread across his knees. A young boy, whose face was still smooth and completely untouched by the razor, sat before him. The boy's hands were shaking so violently he could not unlace his own boots. Without a word, Matthias reached out. His hands were warm, remarkably steady, and smelled faintly of peppermint and rubbing alcohol. He gently pushed the boy's trembling hands away and took the muddy laces into his own fingers. He worked slowly, patiently untying the tight, wet knots. "It is all right, little brother," Matthias whispered, his voice a low, soothing hum that barely carried past the boy's ears. "Let me help you with this. Just lean back against the wall. Close your eyes. You do not need to watch." Matthias slipped the heavy, soaked leather from the boy's feet. He did not recoil at the sight of the pale, ruined skin. He simply took a canteen of tepid water and poured a small, precious amount over a clean cloth. He began to wash the boy's feet, his thumbs moving in slow, rhythmic circles over the aching arches and the frozen toes. The touch of another human being, offered not in urgency but in pure, gentle care, was a powerful medicine. The boy's shaking began to slow. The tension in his shoulders melted away, and he let his head fall back against the cold, damp curve of the bunker wall. "Do you remember the stream behind the old mill?" Matthias whispered, inventing a memory of a hometown he had never seen, knowing the boy only needed a soft place for his mind to rest. "Do you remember how the water felt in the middle of July? Sun warmed over the smooth, flat stones. You could stand in the shallows all afternoon, and the little silver fish would dart around your ankles." The boy kept his eyes closed, a faint, fragile smile touching the corners of his mouth. "Yes," he breathed, his voice barely a rasp. The water was so clear. "It is waiting for you," Matthias murmured, applying a soothing salve to the cracked skin and wrapping the foot in a dry, clean bandage. "The water is still running. The stones are still warm. You just have to rest your feet now, so they are ready to walk into that stream when the summer returns." He patted the boy's knee, a gesture of absolute reassurance, and moved on to the next shadow in the room. Across the bunker, beneath the low arc of the ceiling, an older soldier sat trying to read a letter. He tilted the worn, folded paper to catch the meager light of the lantern. His hands were covered in dozens of tiny, stinging scratches from pushing through the thick, frozen brambles of the woods. The cuts were minor, but in the damp and the dirt, they throbbed with a persistent, nagging heat. Matthias slid quietly onto the bench beside him. He did not interrupt the man's reading. He simply opened a small tin of ointment, the scent of camphor rising into the stale air. He took the man's left hand, turning it palm up, and began to carefully dab the ointment onto each tiny red scratch. The older soldier did not look away from his letter, but he leaned his weight slightly against Matthias's shoulder. It was a silent yielding, a sudden, heavy release of the burden of staying strong. In the dark of the bunker, under the soft touch of the medic, there was no need for bravery. There was only the quiet acceptance of care. "She says the garden has finally gone to sleep for the winter," the older man whispered, his eyes scanning the blurred ink. "She says she covered the rose bushes with burlap, just like I showed her." "She is keeping them safe," Matthias replied softly, his fingers working the ointment into a small scrape on the man's knuckles. "Just as we are kept safe in this stone room. The winter comes, and we go under the earth, and we wait. But the roots are still alive. The roses will remember how to bloom." Matthias wiped the man's hand clean and wrapped a thin layer of gauze around his palm. The older soldier finally folded the letter, tucking it carefully back into the breast pocket of his tunic. He looked at Matthias, his eyes shining wetly in the dim light, and gave a slow, deep nod of gratitude. As the hours stretched on, the heavy steel door remained closed. The air grew warmer, heated by the proximity of so many bodies. It was a strange, stifling kind of comfort. They were buried alive, stacked together in the dark, but in that shared breathing, in the quiet rustle of shifting wool and the low murmurs of whispered conversations, there was a deep, undeniable fellowship. Matthias moved like a gentle ghost through the cramped space. He handed out small, white pills to ease the fever of a coughing boy. He stitched a small tear in the webbing of a man's hand, singing a lullaby under his breath to distract from the sting of the needle. He listened to the fears of boys who missed their mothers, to the anxieties of fathers who wondered if their children would remember their faces. He absorbed all their quiet terrors, filtering them through his own calm spirit, and handed back only comfort. He was the keeper of their humanity in a place built entirely for war. Eventually, the soft, rhythmic sound of deep breathing began to replace the anxious whispers. The exhaustion of the forest finally overtook the claustrophobia of the concrete. Boys slumped against one another, their heads resting on the shoulders of strangers who had become brothers in the dark. The bunker became a single, slowly heaving organism, rising and falling with the collective tide of sleep. Matthias sat back down on his wooden crate. He reached over and turned the small dial on the kerosene lantern, lowering the flame until it was nothing more than a tiny, glowing orange ember. The shadows swallowed the room, leaving only the soft, ambient warmth and the chorus of slow breathing. He rested his tired hands in his lap, the smell of iodine still clinging to his fingertips. He looked around the blackened room, listening to the water dripping softly from the ceiling, feeling the immense, crushing weight of the earth above them. But he did not feel trapped. Looking at the sleeping boys, safe for this one night from the freezing rain and the snapping twigs, he felt only a profound, protective love. The concrete walls were thick and cold, but inside them, the air was warm with life. Close your eyes, and imagine the safety of that buried room. Feel the heavy, quiet earth above you, shielding you from the storms of the world. Listen to the steady, comforting rhythm of breath rising and falling in the dark. Know that there are hands in the darkness waiting to tend to your weariness, waiting to wrap your burdens in clean, white cloth. Let the thick walls hold you safe. Let the darkness soothe your tired eyes. Sleep now, beneath the roots and the rain, and let the quiet warmth of the hidden world carry you gently into dreams of sunlit streams and blooming gardens. Rest your head, and simply breathe. Before the snow even begins to fall, the world holds its breath, and the cold slips in silently, turning the damp earth into iron. It happens in the deepest, quietest hours of the night. The endless, weeping rains that had turned the ancient woods into a sprawling ocean of mud finally cease. But they do not leave comfort behind. Instead, the heavy gray clouds part just enough to reveal a canopy of cold, distant stars, glittering like shattered glass in the black sky. With the clearing of the air, the temperature drops with a sudden, breathless plunge. The dampness that had soaked into the heavy wool coats, into the thick leather boots, and into the very marrow of the soldiers, begins to change. It stops flowing, and it starts to bite. The first frost of the season is a beautiful, terrible thing. In the gentle light of the moon, it paints the edges of the fallen, rotting leaves with delicate, crystalline lace. It turns the fragile, dying ferns into brittle sculptures of glass. It dusts the rough bark of the giant fir trees with a pale, shimmering powder. But for the boys hidden in their shallow scrapes beneath the roots, there is no beauty to be found in the silver woods. There is only a creeping, profound exhaustion. The mud that had held them so close, that had sucked at their boots and stained their hands, now hardens. It freezes solid, locking the folds of their trousers and the soles of their boots into the earth. The wet wool of their uniforms grows completely stiff, cracking softly, like dried parchment, whenever they try to move. Let us sit for a while with an older man named Thomas. Thomas is a man who knows the turning of the seasons. In a life that feels like it belongs to someone else, he was a carpenter. He is used to running his bare, warm hands over smooth, sunlit oak in a dusty, fragrant workshop. Now, his hands are hidden deep within his pockets, his fingers stiff, pale, and aching. The cold does not just touch the skin, it sinks deep into the joints. It brings a dull, throbbing ache that settles heavily in the chest, sapping the very last, lingering reserves of energy. It is a tiredness that sleep cannot cure. Thomas breathes out, and his breath forms a thick, white cloud that hangs in the still air for a long moment before dissolving into the frost. He feels the cold pressing against his cheeks, pinching his nose, whispering against the thin skin of his eyelids. It is a slow, methodical thief, stealing the heat from his body 1 degree at a time. He pulls his knees tighter to his chest, trying to make himself as small as possible, trying to protect the fragile ember of warmth burning faintly in his heart. He is not alone. In the freezing dark of the forest, survival becomes an act of profound, quiet intimacy. Next to Thomas sits young Felix, a boy who still carries the soft, round cheeks of childhood beneath a layer of soot and fatigue. Felix is shivering. It is a deep, uncontrollable tremor that shakes his entire frame, his teeth chattering with a rapid, clicking sound that seems terribly loud in the silent woods. Without a word, Thomas shifts closer. The frozen earth crunches softly beneath him. He unfastens the stiff buttons of his oversized coat and opens it like a heavy gray wing. He pulls Felix against his side, wrapping the thick, frozen wool around them both. They sit shoulder to shoulder, hip to hip, pooling whatever fragile warmth their bodies can still generate. There is no hesitation, no distance between them. In the biting frost, the boundaries of the self dissolve completely. They become one single, breathing entity, fighting back the dark. 2 other soldiers quietly crawl over, their movements slow and clumsy in the freezing night. They join the huddle, leaning their backs against Thomas and Felix, forming a tight, silent circle of humanity beneath a canopy of frozen pine branches. Together, they pull a single, stiff canvas tarp over their heads, creating a tiny, dark tent in the vast wilderness. Beneath the canvas, the air is thick. It smells of damp earth, unwashed wool, and stale breath, but it is marginally, beautifully warmer. It is a desperate kind of shelter. They do not speak. The cold has stolen their words, turning their lips numb and slow. But in the pressing of their shoulders together, in the heavy, shared rhythm of their collective breathing, they are speaking volumes. They are saying, "I am here. We are still alive. We will hold the heat for each other." As the physical world grows increasingly numb, the mind begins to wander, seeking refuge in the glowing embers of memory. Thomas closes his eyes, leaning his heavy head back against the frozen canvas. The dark, freezing forest slowly fades away. He is no longer sitting in a frozen crater in the Hürtgen. He is standing in the doorway of his home. He can see the rich, amber light spilling from the heavy iron stove in the corner of his kitchen. He can hear the soft, rhythmic pop and hiss of dry birch wood burning, throwing bright orange sparks against the glass window of the stove. He imagines his wife sitting in the wooden rocking chair he built for her. He sees a thick, heavy quilt draped over her lap, her hands busy knitting a scarf of deep burgundy yarn. He can almost smell the room, the rich, yeasty scent of bread rising on the counter, the sweet, spicy aroma of roasted apples and cinnamon cooling on the windowsill. The memory is so vivid, so intensely warm, that Thomas feels a phantom heat blooming softly in his chest. He holds onto it tightly. He feeds the memory like a precious, vital fire, letting its gentle glow push back the frost that is creeping up his legs. Beside him, little Felix has stopped shivering quite so violently. His breathing has evened out, slipping into the shallow, heavy rhythm of sleep. Felix is dreaming, too. He is dreaming of his grandfather's study, a small, cozy room lined with dusty, leather-bound books. In his mind, a fat, lazy hound sleeps on a thick woven rug before a crackling, open hearth. Felix imagines burying his freezing hands deep into the dog's thick, warm fur, feeling the steady, thumping heartbeat of the animal beneath his palms. He imagines the heavy velvet curtains drawn tight against the winter night, locking the cold out entirely. He can almost taste the hot milk and honey his grandmother used to bring him in a heavy ceramic mug, the steam warming his face before he even took a sip. These dreams are their only fires. They cannot strike a match in the woods. Even if the wood were not frozen solid, a sudden flame would draw the eyes of the unseen ghosts waiting in the mist. And so, they must rely entirely on the hearths burning in their minds. They wrap themselves in the memory of roaring fireplaces, of steaming mugs held tightly in cupped hands, of thick feather beds and heavy, handmade blankets pulled up to their chins. This is the quiet, everyday heroism of the forest. It is not found in loud declarations or dramatic movements. It is found in an older man wrapping his coat around a shivering boy. It is found in the desperate, beautiful clinging to the memory of love and light when everything around them is dark and freezing. It is the absolute refusal to let the frost reach the heart. The night stretches on, incredibly long and profoundly still. The stars move at a glacial pace across the narrow patches of sky visible through the canopy. Every so often, the immense silence is broken by a sharp, loud crack, the sound of a tree branch, frozen completely solid, snapping under the invisible pressure of the cold. The sound echoes through the woods like a rifle shot, but the huddled men do not flinch. They know the voice of the forest now. They know it is only the ancient timber suffering the bite of the frost alongside them. They wait for the dawn, though they know the sun will bring no real warmth to the deep woods. It will only turn the sky a pale, watery gray, and perhaps illuminate the delicate, cruel frost that covers the world. But the dawn means they have survived another night. It means the internal fires, the shared body heat, and the precious memories of home were enough to keep the shadows at bay for a few hours more. As you listen to the stillness of the night, pull your own blankets a little higher around your shoulders. Feel the soft, heavy warmth of your own bed pressing against you, and breathe in the gentle, safe air of your room. Let the image of those boys, huddled together under the frozen pines, remind you of the profound, simple comfort of a quiet hearth. Close your eyes, and let the biting frost remain outside the glass, far away from where you rest. Sleep now, perfectly safe and entirely warm, while the embers of memory glow softly, keeping watch in the deep, quiet night. Even the oldest giants, who had stood silently through the passing of centuries, could not withstand the sudden, falling thunder. Before the sky began to break, the ancient pines and towering oaks of the Hürtgen had been the silent guardians of the boys huddled in the freezing mud. These trees were impossibly old, their immense trunks covered in thick, rough armor of bark and dark, velvety moss. They had stood watch over the quiet valleys long before these young soldiers were even born. They had seen the gentle turning of countless autumns, the soft arrival of 100 white winters, and the slow, beautiful blooming of forgotten springs. To sit beneath them was to feel entirely small, yet wonderfully protected. The immense, woven roof of deep green needles seemed thick enough to hold back the very weight of the world. But war, the boys were learning, does not respect the sacred quiet of the deep woods. It did not begin with a sudden, deafening crash. To the exhausted soldiers, buried in their shallow, freezing scrapes, it sounded at first like a low, rolling groan moving across the heavy gray clouds. It was a deep, distant thunder that made the cold mud vibrate against their chests. And then, the air pressure shifted. The stillness of the forest was suddenly sucked away, replaced by a rushing, tearing sound high above. The iron falling from the sky did not strike the earth. It found the high canopy. For the soldiers pressed against the ground, the great betrayal of the forest was an agonizing, heartbreaking thing to witness. The iron shattered against the thick, reaching arms of the ancient firs. In an instant, the grand, living roof that had hidden them from the weeping sky was turned into a storm of heavy, flying wood. The trees, caught in the tearing wind of the artillery, burst violently outward. Great, sweeping branches, thick as a man's waist, snapped with a sound like the breaking of massive cello strings. The forest, which had been a beautiful, silent sanctuary, began to rain down upon them in jagged, pale shards. Let us sit beside a soldier named Julian. In the years before the world lost its way, Julian had been a forester. He was a man who understood the quiet language of the woods. He knew the difference between the rough, comforting bark of an old oak and the smooth, papery skin of a silver birch. He knew how to read the rings of a fallen log, tracing the history of droughts and rainy seasons drawn perfectly in the pale wood. To Julian, walking among the trees was a kind of prayer. As the deep, rolling thunder shook the valley, Julian did not just fear for his own life. He pressed his face into the damp earth, covering his head with his cold hands, and he wept for the forest. Through the narrow gap of his fingers, he watched a colossal spruce, a magnificent, towering king of the woods that must have been a fragile sapling when horse-drawn carriages first wandered these hills, take a direct, punishing blow. Julian watched in absolute sorrow as the great trunk shuddered. It seemed to hold on for one long, desperate moment, its deep roots gripping the frozen clay. And then, with a profound, agonizing groan that sounded terribly like a living thing in pain, the ancient giant bowed. Its crown tore away, and it fell slowly, heavily, crashing through the smaller trees, taking smaller branches with it, until it struck the earth with a hollow, echoing thud that vibrated through Julian's very bones. When the heavy thunder finally rolled away, leaving behind a ringing, dusty silence, the air in the Hürtgen had changed completely. It no longer smelled only of damp wool and freezing mud. The air was suddenly, overwhelmingly thick with the scent of fresh, raw sap. It was a deeply sweet, resinous perfume, the sharp, clean smell of a carpenter's workshop or a family living room on the morning of a winter holiday. It was the scent of pure, living wood, exposed to the cold air for the very first time. To Julian, it was the smell of the forest bleeding. He slowly pushed himself up from the mud, his gray coat dusted with a thick layer of fine, pale sawdust that looked like a dusting of strange, dry snow. He looked around the ruined cathedral of the woods. The canopy was torn open, revealing jagged patches of the bruised, weeping sky. The pale, yellow flesh of the shattered trees shone brightly against the dark, freezing gloom. The trunks were weeping golden tears of sap, slow and thick, catching the meager light of the afternoon. The sorrow that settled over Julian was a heavy, suffocating blanket. He saw the broken wood scattered across the forest floor, resting heavily upon the sleeping holes of his friends. The ancients had been forced to strike the very boys they had been trying to protect. A few yards away, a young boy named Emile was struggling to push a heavy, green bough off his legs. Emile was incredibly young, his face pale and smudged with dark earth, his eyes wide and trembling with the shock of the falling sky. Julian moved toward him. He did not run, his legs were too heavy, his spirit too tired. He waded slowly through the sea of torn pine needles and jagged splinters. When he reached Emile, he knelt in the mud. He placed his hands on the thick, rough bark of the fallen branch. It was incredibly heavy, dense with the autumn rains and the creeping frost. Julian closed his eyes, took a deep, shaky breath, and lifted. He pulled the heavy wood aside, setting it gently, almost reverently, upon the earth. Emile was weeping, a quiet, breathless sobbing. His left arm was bruised and hanging limply at his side, struck by the falling timber. He looked up at the broken canopy, terrified that the sky would fall again. Julian unbuttoned his canteen and brought it to Emile's trembling lips. "Drink, little one," he whispered, his voice incredibly soft, a gentle hum against the shattered quiet of the woods. "Drink. The thunder has passed. The sky is quiet now." Emile swallowed the cold water, but his eyes darted nervously to the pale, torn trunk of the tree that had struck him. "It tried to hurt us," the boy whispered, his voice breaking. "The forest is trying to hurt us." Julian felt a deep ache in his chest. He reached down and picked up a piece of the shattered wood. It was a long, flat splinter of pale yellow pine, smooth on one side and jagged on the other. It smelled wonderfully sweet and clean. Julian held it up, letting Emile smell the rich resin. "No, Emile," Julian murmured, his eyes full of a quiet, profound grace. "The forest did not want to hurt you. The tree was only trying to catch the iron before it could reach the ground. It stood tall, and it caught the thunder for us. It broke so that we wouldn't have to." Julian took a clean, white bandage from his pocket. He placed the smooth, fragrant piece of pine gently against Emile's bruised arm, using it as a delicate splint. He wrapped the white cloth carefully around the boy's arm and the wood, binding them together. "Do you see?" Julian whispered, tying a small, neat knot. "Even now, even when it is broken and lying in the mud, the tree is still trying to protect you. It is holding your arm straight. It is sharing its strength with you." Emile looked down at the splint. The sweet smell of the pine seemed to soothe his panicked breathing. He touched the smooth wood with his good hand, and slowly, the terror in his eyes began to soften into a quiet, melancholy understanding. He leaned his head against Julian's shoulder, finding comfort in the steady, warm presence of the older man. Julian held the boy, his hand resting gently on the back of Emile's damp collar. He looked around the ruined grove. The destruction was immense. The beautiful, ancient symmetry of the woods was gone, replaced by a chaotic, jagged tangle of torn roots and splintered crowns. He saw another soldier, a boy he only knew by sight, quietly picking up a shattered bird's nest from the mud. The small, woven cup of twigs and dried grass had been thrown from the high branches. The boy held it in his cupped hands for a long moment, his head bowed, before gently placing it into a hollow at the base of a surviving oak, tucking it away safely into the dark earth. It was these small, quiet movements of reverence that kept the boys human. In a world that was suddenly raining iron and broken timber, they still found the grace to comfort a bruised arm, to mourn a fallen nest, to speak gently to the weeping trees. Julian reached into his own pocket and felt the crisp, folded edge of a letter he had written to his father days ago, a letter he still carried because there was no way to send it through the endless mud. In it, he had described the majesty of the ancient firs, how they reminded him of the great pillars of a cathedral. He realized now that the letter was a memorial. It was a quiet testament to a beautiful world that had existed just yesterday, a world that was now bleeding its golden sap into the freezing clay. The afternoon light began to fade, pulling the gray shadows long and thin across the torn forest floor. The air grew perfectly still once more. The weeping of the sap slowed as the cold returned, freezing the golden tears against the pale wood. Julian pulled his heavy coat tighter around himself and Emile. They settled back down into the earth, surrounded by the fragrant, broken pieces of the ancient guardians. It was a tragic, heartbreaking beauty. They were resting in a graveyard of giants, wrapped in the sweet, clean scent of the torn pine. Let the quiet sorrow of the woods fade into a gentle peace. The thunder has passed, and the forest, though broken, is finally resting. Feel the slow, steady rhythm of your own breathing. Let the sweet, imagined scent of fresh pine clear your mind of any lingering worries. The trees have caught the storm, and they have held it back so that you might find sleep in the quiet dark. Rest now, safely held in the gentle silence that follows the rain, and let the long, peaceful night embrace you. There is a profound, aching loneliness that settles in the bottom of a deep ravine, a quiet feeling that the rest of the world has simply moved on and forgotten you are there. If you were to walk through the Hürtgen in the fading light of late autumn, you would eventually find the earth falling sharply away beneath your boots. This is the gorge of the Kahl River. It is a massive, dark scar cut deeply into the forest floor, a place where the trees grow at strange, desperate angles, reaching hungrily for a sky they can barely see. The sides of the gorge are impossibly steep, covered in slick, loose shale, tangled roots, and a thick, treacherous paste of freezing mud. When you begin the descent into this valley, you leave the wind behind. You leave the horizon behind. The light, already pale and weak, struggles to penetrate the dense canopy and the steep, rocky walls. By the time you reach the bottom, where the shallow, freezing river endlessly murmurs over dark stones, you are wrapped in a permanent, twilight shadow. For the boys ordered to hold this deep cut in the earth, the geography was not just a line on a map, it was a physical trap. The gorge isolated them. It cut them off from the distant supply wagons, from the comforting sight of their comrades on the higher ridges, and, most terribly, from the feeling that they were part of something larger. Down in the damp and the dark, surrounded by towering walls of ancient rock and rotting timber, it was incredibly easy to believe that the generals in their warm, brightly lit rooms had simply misplaced them. Let us follow a young messenger named Anton as he makes his way down the treacherous trail. Anton is only 19, but his eyes carry the heavy, slow weariness of a man who has walked too many miles in the cold. Across his chest, cutting into the thick, damp wool of his oversized coat, is a heavy leather strap holding a small, sealed satchel. His breath plumes in the freezing air, short, quiet clouds that instantly dissolve into the surrounding mist. The path beneath his boots is barely a path at all. It is a narrow, winding ribbon of mud and shattered slate, barely wider than his own shoulders. To his right, the dark earth rises like a wall. To his left, the ground simply vanishes into the misty abyss of the gorge. Anton moves with painstaking care. He does not march, he slides. He steps sideways, placing his heavy boot against the exposed, gnarly root of an oak tree, testing his weight before he fully commits. It is so quiet here. The silence of the gorge is not a peaceful silence, it is a heavy, expectant hush, broken only by the sound of Anton's own labored breathing and the wet, rhythmic crunch of his boots. Every now and then, a loose stone gives way beneath his heel, tumbling over the edge and falling down, down, down into the gray fog. Anton stops and listens to it fall. He waits to hear the distant splash as it hits the river below, but the mist simply swallows the sound, leaving him feeling even more entirely alone. He is exhausted. His thighs burn with the immense effort of holding himself back against the steep incline. His hands, clad in thin, damp mittens, are scraped and bruised from clinging to the freezing bark of the trees to keep from slipping. But Anton keeps moving, because he is a thread. He is the only fragile line connecting the boys at the bottom of the gorge to the world above. In his leather satchel, wrapped carefully in an oilcloth to protect it from the creeping damp, is a map. It is a new map, drafted only a day ago in a comfortable headquarters miles behind the tree line. Anton can still remember the room where it was handed to him. He remembers the warmth of the coal stove in the corner. He remembers the smell of hot chicory coffee and the sharp, clean scent of fresh ink. He remembers the older officer, his uniform clean and dry, tapping the crisp, white paper with a perfectly sharpened pencil. "Take this to the commander in the Call Gorge," the officer had said. "It shows the new lines of defense. It shows where the reinforcements will be placed." Anton clings to the memory of that warm room as he navigates another slick, icy bend in the trail. He imagines the heat of the stove radiating against his frozen cheeks. He uses the memory as a shield against the biting cold of the ravine, letting his mind wander back to a time when he felt warm, when he felt safe. He remembers a holiday he took with his family when he was just a small boy. They had visited a gorge in the south, a beautiful, sunlit place where the water ran crystal clear and the birds sang from every branch. He remembers sitting on his father's shoulders, feeling incredibly tall, looking down at the sparkling river. He tries to superimpose that warm, golden memory over the freezing, gray reality of the Hürtgen. He tries to pretend that the mist clinging to the dark pines is just the morning dew, waiting for the sun to burn it away. As Anton finally nears the bottom of the trail, the smell of the air begins to change. The crisp, sharp scent of the higher woods is replaced by the heavy, stagnant odor of wet stone, decaying ferns, and deep, undisturbed earth. Through the dense fog, he begins to see the faint, ghostly outlines of the men. They are huddled together beneath the overhanging rocks, seeking whatever meager shelter the cliffs can provide. They look like statues carved from the mud itself. Their coats are entirely brown with clay. Their helmets are dull and smeared with earth. They do not speak. They simply sit, their knees pulled tight to their chests, their hollow eyes watching Anton emerge from the mist like a visitor from another world. There is a profound, quiet sorrow in their gaze. It is the look of men who have been waiting in the dark for a very long time, men who have almost forgotten what the sun feels like on their faces. Anton approaches a small hollow carved into the side of the gorge, covered by a sagging piece of dark canvas. This is the command post. He pushes the heavy, wet canvas aside and steps into the tiny, cramped space. Inside, sitting on an overturned ammunition crate, is an older officer named Franz. Franz's face is deeply lined, pale, and covered in a week's worth of graying stubble. A tiny, shielded candle burns on a rock beside him, casting a weak, flickering amber glow over his tired features. Anton comes to attention, though his legs are trembling so badly he can barely stand straight. He fumbles with the stiff, frozen buckle of his satchel. His fingers are numb, clumsy blocks of wood, but he finally manages to open the flap. He pulls out the oilcloth, unrolls it, and presents the crisp, rolled paper to the officer. From command, "Sir," Anton whispers, his voice cracking from the cold and the long silence of his journey. The new map. Franz looks at the boy. He sees the exhaustion written in the dark circles under Anton's eyes. He sees the violent shivering of the boy's shoulders, the mud caked halfway up his frozen trousers. Slowly, gently, Franz takes the map. He unrolls it upon his knees, leaning closer to the tiny flame of the candle. For a moment, the small hollow is illuminated by the bright, absurd perfection of the paper. The map is incredibly beautiful. It is clean and white, untouched by the rain or the mud. It is covered in perfectly straight lines of blue and red ink. There are neat, sweeping arrows indicating troop movements. There are precise, carefully measured boxes showing where the new defensive positions should be built. It is a masterpiece of military strategy, drafted by men looking down from a very great height. But as Franz looks at the crisp paper, and then looks out past the canvas flap into the freezing, chaotic, impassable mire of the gorge, a slow, gentle smile touches his cracked lips. He knows, immediately, that the map is entirely useless. The neat blue lines are drawn across slopes so steep a man cannot stand on them without sliding into the river. The sweeping red arrows point through dense, tangled thickets of ancient roots that no vehicle could ever penetrate. The beautifully measured boxes dictate defensive positions in areas that are currently under 3 feet of freezing, rushing water. The men in the warm rooms far away have drawn a map of a forest that exists only in their minds. They have tried to impose straight lines and perfect logic onto a deep, dark gorge that obeys only the ancient rules of earth and water. But Franz does not grow angry. He does not curse the generals or tear the beautifully drawn paper in half. He simply rolls the map back into a neat tube. He looks up at Anton, whose eyes are wide, waiting for a command. "Thank you, Anton," Franz says, his voice incredibly soft, a low, rumbling hum of pure kindness. "You have done very well to bring this to us." Franz reaches down and picks up a small, battered metal canteen. He unscrews the cap and holds it out to the shivering boy. "Sit," Franz whispers, gesturing to a relatively dry patch of earth beside his crate. "Rest your legs. Drink. It is only water, but I kept it near the candle. The chill is off it." Anton sinks to the ground, his heavy legs finally giving way. He takes the canteen in his bruised, numb hands. He brings it to his lips and drinks. The water is tepid, tasting faintly of old metal, but to Anton, it is the greatest comfort he has ever known. It washes away the dry, burning ache in his throat. As Anton rests, he watches Franz place the useless map carefully into a waterproof tin, putting it away in the dark. In that quiet moment, sitting by the flickering candlelight, Anton suddenly understands. The strategy on the paper does not matter. The blue lines and the red arrows are meaningless in the shadows of the gorge. What matters is the journey. What matters is that Anton walked through the cold and the dark to find them. The true value of the map was not the information it held, but the fact that it was sent at all. By sending the messenger, the world above had finally reached down into the abyss. They had said, "We know you are there. We have not forgotten you." For Franz, and for the hollow-eyed men huddled under the rocks outside, Anton's arrival is a lifeline. It is a reminder that they are still tethered to humanity. The boy's muddy, exhausted presence is a far greater comfort than any strategic plan ever could be. He brought them the quiet, everyday heroism of his own endurance. He brought them the warmth of a shared struggle. Franz reaches over and rests his heavy, gloved hand gently on Anton's shoulder. It is a fatherly touch, a quiet anchor in the dim light. "You will stay with us tonight, little brother," Franz murmurs, his eyes crinkling with a warm, weary affection. "The trail is too dark to climb now. Tomorrow, you can return to the world above. But tonight, you will rest here with us. You are safe now." Anton leans his head back against the cold stone wall of the hollow. His eyes grow incredibly heavy. The burning in his legs begins to fade, replaced by a deep, soft lethargy. He listens to the sound of the freezing river rushing over the stones just a few yards away. In the absolute darkness of the gorge, the sound of the water is no longer a lonely sound. It becomes a gentle, continuous lullaby, a soft rushing noise that masks the silence of the forest above. He is surrounded by the sleeping forms of other boys, their slow, measured breathing harmonizing with the river. They are hidden away in the deepest crack of the earth, trapped by the geography, forgotten by the bright, neat maps of the world. But in this small, damp hollow, warmed by a single candle and the presence of a kind officer, Anton feels a profound, unexpected peace. He closes his eyes. The shadows of the gorge wrap around him like a heavy, protective blanket. Let the deep, quiet darkness of the ravine soothe you. Let the gentle, rushing sound of the water wash away the sharp edges of the day. Know that even in the deepest shadows, even when you feel entirely isolated from the bright world above, there is always a connection waiting to be made. There is always a hand reaching out to offer a resting place. Release the weight of the long journey. Let your heavy limbs finally go still. Sleep now, hidden safely away in the quiet depths, and let the gentle, whispering dark hold you close until the morning comes. When the snow finally comes to the deep woods, it does not arrive with a roar, but with the gentle, hushed whisper of 1,000 tiny, falling stars. After the endless, weeping rains, and after the cruel, biting bite of the first frost, the heavy gray clouds that have lingered over the forest for weeks finally soften. They open their arms, and they release a slow, drifting curtain of perfect white. It is a profound and merciful transformation. The snow falls without a sound, landing lightly upon the jagged, splintered branches of the shattered pines. It drifts gently down into the deep, dark ravines, slowly covering the frozen mud and the scars of the earth. In just a few quiet hours, the entire world is changed. The sharp edges of the forest are smoothed away, replaced by soft, rolling curves of pure, untouched white. With the snow comes a deep, insulated silence. It is a quiet so absolute, so heavy and peaceful, that it feels as though the forest itself has simply decided to go to sleep. The terrible noises of the world cannot travel through the thick, falling snow. The wind loses its sharp edge, becoming nothing more than a soft sigh brushing through the highest branches. For the soldiers huddled beneath the earth, wrapped in their heavy, stiff coats, this sudden, snowy silence is a rare and beautiful gift. It is a momentary truce declared by nature herself. In this vast, white quiet, there is a pause. There is no marching tonight. There is no struggling through the mire. There is only the gentle, rhythmic breathing of tired men resting in the dark, and the slow, hypnotic dance of the snowflakes falling through the trees. It is in these quiet, stolen moments that the mind inevitably turns toward home. Deep within a shallow hollow, carved out beneath the massive, sheltering roots of an ancient oak. A faint, amber glow pushes softly against the dark. It is a tiny flame, no larger than a firefly, carefully shielded by a pair of cupped, shivering hands. Let us sit quietly beside the man holding the light. His name is Wilhelm. Wilhelm is older than many of the boys sleeping in the snow around him. His face carries the deep, gentle lines of a man who has smiled often in his life, though those lines are now filled with the dark dust of the forest. He wears a heavy woolen scarf, knitted by hands he loves, wrapped tightly around his neck. His breath forms tiny, white clouds in the freezing air, but he does not seem to notice the cold. All of his attention, all of his remaining energy, is focused entirely on the small, crumpled piece of paper resting on his knee. In his right hand, Wilhelm holds a tiny stub of a graphite pencil. His fingers are pale, swollen from the cold, and terribly numb. They are the hands of a man who has dug through frozen clay and carried heavy iron, hands that are no longer suited for delicate things. It takes an immense, concentrated effort just to grip the small piece of wood, to force his stiff joints to remember how to form the loops and lines of letters. But Wilhelm must write. He has a daughter waiting for him in a city far away. Her name is Clara, and she is only 7 years old. She is a little girl with bright, curious eyes and a laugh that used to fill the hallways of their small apartment like sunshine. As Wilhelm sits in the freezing dark, he can almost hear that laugh. He can almost smell the warm, sweet scent of the vanilla soap she uses before bed. He closes his eyes for a moment, letting the memory wash over him, letting it warm the deep, aching hollow in his chest. When he opens his eyes, he looks down at the blank paper. The weight of what he must do presses heavily upon his tired shoulders. He knows, in the quiet, honest stillness of his own heart, that he may never walk through the door of their apartment again. He knows that the forest is vast, and the winter is long, and his strength is slowly fading into the snow. And so, this small, crumpled piece of paper is not just a letter. It is his legacy. It is the very last piece of his heart that he can send out into the world. How does a father say goodbye to a little girl without breaking her heart? How does he explain the freezing mud, the shattered trees, and the immense, crushing dark? He doesn't. With a slow, trembling hand, Wilhelm presses the pencil to the paper. He chooses, instead, to build a beautiful, fragile shield of words. He chooses to leave her with a fairy tale. My dearest, sweetest little bird, he writes, his handwriting shaky and uneven, a testament to the cold that grips his knuckles. I am writing to you tonight from a magical place. The winter has finally come to the woods where I am staying, and I wish so deeply that you could be here to see it with me. He pauses, taking a slow, shallow breath of the freezing air, and pictures her face as she reads these words. He imagines her sitting by the window in their living room, watching the snow fall on the cobblestones. The trees here are older and taller than any buildings you have ever seen, he continues, the graphite softly scratching against the thin paper. And tonight, they are all wearing magnificent white cloaks. The snow is falling so softly, Clara. It looks just like the powdered sugar the baker sprinkles over his pastries on Sunday mornings. It covers everything, making the whole world look like a soft, fluffy cloud. Wilhelm smiles, a genuine, gentle smile that pushes back the shadows in his hollow. He is no longer a weary soldier in a frozen trench. He is a storyteller, weaving a blanket of comfort for the person he loves most. It is very peaceful here, he writes, the lie resting gently on his conscience, a necessary sacrifice for her peace of mind. The forest is very quiet. The other men and I are sitting together, telling stories and staying warm. We saw a little brown rabbit today, hopping through the snow, leaving a trail of tiny footprints behind him. I thought of you, and how you would have wanted to feed him a carrot from your pocket. He stops writing for a moment, his fingers cramping painfully. He gently rubs his thumb against his forefinger, trying to coax the blood back into his hand. He looks out into the dark woods. The snow is falling heavier now, a thick, swirling curtain of white that hides the world away. He knows he must finish the letter. He must find the brave words to close the page. Clara, he writes, pressing a little harder, the lines becoming darker, thicker with emotion. I want you to be so very good for your mother. Help her sweep the floor, and remember to leave a little saucer of milk out for the stray cat that visits our steps. And I want you to know, my sweet bird, that whenever you look at the snow falling outside your window, I am looking at the very same snow. It touches my cheek here, and it touches your window there, and in that way, we are not so far apart at all. His eyes are burning, welling with tears that threaten to freeze against his eyelashes. But he blinks them away. He will not let his sorrow stain this page. He will only give her his light. Do not worry about me, he writes, his final, beautiful gift of courage. I am safe beneath the great trees. I love you more than all the stars hidden behind the winter clouds. Sleep well, my little bird. He signs his name. Just as he finishes the final loop of the last letter, a sudden, soft breeze moves through the hollow. It lifts the edge of the heavy canvas above his head, just for a second. A single, delicate snowflake dances into his tiny sanctuary. It drifts down through the amber light of the candle, spinning slowly, gracefully, before coming to rest perfectly upon the paper. It lands right on the ink of his signed name. Wilhelm does not brush it away. He sits perfectly still, watching as the warmth of the tiny candle flame reaches the snowflake. It slowly melts, turning into a single, perfect drop of water. The water sinks into the thin paper, mixing with the dark blue ink. The sharp, precise lines of his name begin to blur. The ink spreads outward, a soft, blooming smudge of color against the pale page. It is a beautiful, melancholic mark. It is the forest itself signing the letter. It is the winter sky pressing a gentle, wet kiss to the paper, merging the freezing reality of the woods with the profound warmth of a father's love. Wilhelm looks at the smudge, and he feels a strange, quiet peace settle over his heart. He has done all that he can do. He has found the brave words. With incredible care, he folds the letter. He folds it once, matching the corners perfectly, and then folds it again, making a small, neat square. He unbuttons the top of his heavy, gray coat, ignoring the sudden rush of cold air against his chest. He slips the folded paper deep into his breast pocket, placing it securely right over his heart. He buttons his coat tight against the chill. He feels the small, reassuring weight of the paper resting there. It may be weeks before the mail wagons can push through the snow. It may be months. The letter may simply stay in his pocket forever, a silent passenger on his journey through the woods. But it does not matter. The act of writing it has anchored him. The love has been spoken into the dark, and that is enough. He leans his head back against the frozen earth, blowing out the tiny candle. The darkness rushes back in, absolute and soft. All around him, in 100 other shallow hollows buried beneath the snow, other men are doing the very same thing. The forest is entirely silent, but it is vibrating with the quiet, desperate love of 1,000 unsent letters. There are boys holding folded papers against their chests, dreaming of mothers and sweethearts, brothers and friends. They are a vast, hidden choir, singing a silent song of longing into the falling snow. The winter has trapped them in the earth, but their hearts are traveling miles away, slipping through the snow-covered branches, soaring over the frozen rivers, and settling gently into the warm rooms of the people they love. Listen to the absolute stillness of the snowy night. Let the deep, hushed quiet of the forest wrap around you like a thick, woolen blanket. The world outside may be cold, and the snow may be falling heavy and fast, but within the heart, there is always a fire burning. There is always a warm, safe place built out of love and memory. Close your eyes and feel the gentle weight of the unseen snow drifting down through the dark. Let the sharp edges of your day blur and soften, just like the ink smudged by the snowflake on the page. Rest your head, knowing that love travels through the deepest woods and the coldest nights, finding its way home no matter the distance. Sleep now, held safely in the quiet, peaceful embrace of the winter dark. There is a heartbreaking softness in the face of a child who has been dressed in the heavy, rough armor of a man. The winter had settled deep into the marrow of the Hürtgen Forest, turning the once vibrant woods into a monochrome world of skeletal branches and suffocating white. The old soldiers, those who had survived the autumn rains and the first biting frosts, had become like the trees themselves, gnarled, silent, and deeply rooted in the frozen earth. But then, through the shifting curtains of snow and the gray morning mist, a new sound arrived. It was not the heavy, measured tread of veterans, but the hurried, uncertain footsteps of those who were entirely new to the shadows. They emerged from the tree lane like pale ghosts, a long line of boys who looked as though they had been plucked from schoolrooms and workshops only days before. They were young, terribly, impossibly young. Some were barely 17, their voices still prone to the occasional high-pitched break, their chins smooth and untouched by the necessity of a razor. They stood in the clearing, their eyes wide and darting, overwhelmed by the immense and different scale of the ancient pines. Everything about them was too large. Their steel helmets sat low on their brows, threatening to slide over their eyes with every sudden movement. Their rifles, heavy and cold, seemed like burdensome weights rather than tools of protection. But most poignant of all were their coats. They were clad in oversized gray wool that reached down past their knees, the sleeves swallowed their hands, and the high collars rose up to brush against their red, cold-nipped ears. They looked like children playing at being soldiers, lost in the vast, dark theater of a story they didn't yet understand. Among the veterans watching from the edge of the foxholes was a man named Dieter. Dieter was not an old man by the calendar, but the forest had aged him in ways that years cannot. His face was a map of exhaustion, his eyes hooded and weary, yet they retained a flicker of something soft, a lingering ember of the father he had been before the world turned to iron and ice. He watched a specific boy, a slender youth named Stefan, who had been assigned to his small patch of frozen earth. Stefan was trembling, and it wasn't just the cold. He was staring at the splintered remains of a nearby oak, his breath coming in short, panicked puffs of white. To the boy, the forest was a monster, a place of unseen ghosts and falling thunder. Dieter did not shout. He did not offer a stern greeting or a list of demands. Instead, he moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a gardener tending to a fragile sapling. He stepped out of his shallow hole, the frozen snow crunching softly under his boots, and walked over to where Stefan stood paralyzed. With a hand that was rough and scarred, but incredibly gentle, Dieter reached out and adjusted the boy's heavy helmet, tilting it back so Stefan could see the world more clearly. Then, he reached for the boy's collar. "The wind is a thief, little one," Dieter whispered, his voice a low, soothing rasp that seemed to belong to the trees themselves. "If you leave your neck open, it will steal the heat from your chest before the moon even rises. Fold it like this. See? 2 buttons, right to the chin. It's a small house you carry with you. Keep the door closed." Stefan looked up, his eyes glassy and fearful, but as Dieter's warm fingers worked the stiff buttons, the boy's breathing began to slow. The simple, domestic act of being cared for, of having a collar straightened by a steady hand, was a tether to a reality that didn't involve the gray mist and the iron. "Come," Dieter murmured, beckoning him toward the shelter of a hollow beneath the roots of a massive fir. "The earth is cold, but she is a better friend than the wind. We will make a nest." Inside the shallow scrape, Dieter began to teach the boy the quiet, invisible arts of survival. He didn't speak of tactics or lines of fire. He spoke of the small things, the human things. He showed Stefan how to take his damp woolen mittens and tuck them deep inside his tunic, against his bare skin, so that his own heartbeat would dry them while he slept. He showed him how to wrap his feet in extra scraps of dry burlap, binding them tight over his socks to create a barrier against the creeping damp of the floor. "You must listen to your body," Dieter whispered as they sat shoulder to shoulder in the cramped dark. It will tell you when it's getting too cold. If your toes go silent and stop aching, that is when you must wake up and move them. You must keep the blood dancing, even when it wants to sleep. As the afternoon light faded into a bruised, purple twilight, the forest grew even more silent. The cold deepened, a physical pressure that seemed to squeeze the very air. Stefan sat rigidly, his hands buried deep in his oversized sleeves, jumping at the sound of every snapping twig or falling clump of snow. "I'm scared, sir," the boy breathed, the confession barely a ripple in the still air. "It's so big. The trees, they feel like they're watching us." Dieter leaned back against the frozen earth and closed his eyes. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, smooth stone, a piece of river glass he had carried since the beginning, a souvenir from a summer afternoon spent skipping stones with his own son. He pressed the stone into Stefan's palm. "The trees have seen 1,000 winters, Stefan. They don't care about our quarrels. They are just waiting for the spring, just like you. Hold that stone. It's lived in the sun for a long time. It remembers what the heat feels like." The boy gripped the stone tightly, his knuckles turning white. Dieter pulled his own oversized coat wider, draping the heavy, frozen hem over Stefan's knees, effectively doubling the insulation between them. "My boy back home," Dieter continued, his voice drifting like wood smoke through the dark, "he's about your height. He probably has a coat just like this one now. I like to think that someone is sitting with him tonight, showing him how to button his collar. I like to think that if we all look after the boy sitting next to us, then maybe everyone gets looked after in the end." In the deep, freezing night of the Hürtgen, this was the true resistance. It was the refusal to become as hard as the steel they carried. It was a weary man choosing to be a father to a stranger's son. It was the quiet, everyday heroism of sharing warmth that you barely had for yourself. Stefan eventually succumbed to the weight of his exhaustion. His head dropped onto Dieter's shoulder, his breathing becoming a slow, rhythmic sigh. The oversized helmet finally slipped forward, resting its rim against Dieter's arm. The veteran did not move. He sat perfectly still, a silent guardian in the dark, feeling the fragile warmth of the boy radiating through the thick wool. He looked out into the white-dusted woods. The snow was falling again, a gentle, hypnotic curtain that seemed to bless the huddled forms in the earth. Dieter thought of the thousands of other boys in oversized coats, scattered like lost seeds across the forest floor. He whispered a silent prayer to the ancient pines, not for victory, not for glory, but simply for the morning. He prayed that the sun would find them all, still breathing, still dreaming of the homes they had left behind. As the night stretched toward its coldest hour, Dieter pulled the boy a little closer. He felt the small, smooth stone in Stefan's hand, a tiny anchor of summer in an ocean of winter. The forest murmured around them, the wind singing a low, mournful lullaby through the needles, but inside their small nest of earth and wool, there was a profound, defiant peace. Listen to the hush of the falling snow. Feel the weight of the heavy blankets over your own shoulders, and let the warmth of your own room settle deep into your bones. The world outside may be vast and cold, but there is always a hand to reach for, always a collar to be buttoned, always a shared moment of kindness that can keep the frost away from the heart. Let the image of the old soldier and the young boy fade into a soft, golden blur. Release the tensions of the day, and let your mind drift like a snowflake through the quiet branches. Sleep now, held safely in the memory of those who looked after one another in the dark, and let the gentle, whispering night carry you into a rest that is deep, warm, and entirely peaceful. Sometimes, the heart does not break with a loud crack, but with a long, slow surrender to the rain. If you were to stand very still in the deep, charcoal shadows of the Hürtgen as November leaned heavily into December, you would feel a weight that has nothing to do with the gravity of the earth. It was a pressure that existed in the air itself, a thick, invisible tide that had been rising for weeks, pressing against the chests of the men huddled in the dirt. It was the weight of iron, and it was the weight of rain. For the soldiers in the gray coats, the forest had stopped being a place of trees and had become a place of pure endurance. A test where the only question left was how much a human spirit could bear before it simply dissolved into the mist. The pressure from the west was not like a lightning strike. It was more like the slow, inexorable movement of a glacier. Every hour of every day, the American presence was felt as a constant, low-grade thrum. It was the sound of distant engines that never seemed to sleep, a mechanical heartbeat that vibrated through the frozen mud and into the bones of the men who lay upon it. It was the sound of iron falling from the sky, not in a sudden storm, but in a steady, rhythmic cadence. Crump. 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 It was the sound of the world being methodically dismantled, one branch, one foxhole, one spirit at a time. Let us sit for a moment with a man named Conrad. Conrad was a man of quiet habits, a man who, in a different life, had spent his afternoons tending to a small orchard of pear trees. He understood the patience of nature. He knew that you could not hurry the ripening of a fruit or the turning of a leaf. But in the Hürtgen, Conrad was learning a different kind of patience. He was learning how to be a stone. He sat in a shallow depression beneath a shelf of frozen slate, his hands tucked deep into his armpits. His uniform was no longer gray, it was the color of the forest, a mottled, stained brown, heavy with the weight of 1,000 raindrops and the fine, gray dust of shattered stone. Beside him lay his rifle, a piece of cold iron that he had not fired in days. There was no one to shoot at. There were only the shadows, the mist, and the falling iron. Conrad watched the younger men in his unit. He saw how their eyes had changed. They were no longer bright with the sharp flickers of fear or the heat of adrenaline. Instead, they had become opaque, like the surface of a frozen pond. They moved with a slow, underwater lethargy, their limbs heavy and uncoordinated. When a shell landed nearby, sending a spray of icy mud into the air, they did not flinch. They simply blinked slowly, wiped the grime from their faces, and went back to staring at the wall of fog. The forest was like a great sponge that had finally reached its limit. It could hold no more water, no more iron, and no more sorrow. Everything was saturated. Conrad reached into his pocket and felt a small, rectangular object wrapped in a piece of oilcloth. It was a photograph of his wife, Marta, and their 2 young daughters. He didn't pull it out. He didn't need to see it with his eyes. He could feel the edges of the card through the fabric, and in his mind, he could see every detail, the way Marta's hair caught the light in their garden, the small, gap-toothed smile of his youngest, the way the sun made the pear blossoms look like fallen snow. But as the iron continued to fall, and the rain continued to seep through his collar, Conrad realized with a quiet, hollow ache that the memory was becoming harder to hold onto. The weight of the forest was trying to crush the garden. The sound of the shells was trying to drown out the sound of the girls' laughter. "Sergeant?" A voice, thin and fragile as a dried leaf, drifted from a nearby hole. It was Hans, a boy who had arrived only a week ago, though he looked as though he had lived in the mud for a century. "Yes, Hans," Conrad replied, his voice a low, soothing murmur, the sound of a father comforting a child in the middle of a long, dark night. Do you think the sun is still up there?" Hans asked. He was looking up at the heavy, bruised sky, where the gray clouds seemed to touch the tops of the broken pines. "I haven't seen a shadow in so long. I feel like we're at the bottom of a well." Conrad shifted his weight, feeling the wet clay sigh beneath him. "The sun is there, Hans. It's just resting. It's letting the clouds have their turn. Back in the orchard, we used to have days like this in the late autumn. The mist would be so thick you couldn't see the next tree over. But the pears were still growing in the dark. They were just waiting for their moment." "I don't think I can wait much longer, Sergeant," Hans whispered. There was no drama in his voice, no panic. It was a simple statement of fact. His spirit had reached its saturation point. He had carried the weight as far as he could. Conrad looked at the boy, and then he looked down the line at the others. He saw the way they were hunched over, their shoulders bowed as if they were carrying the entire weight of the Hürtgen on their backs. He realized then that it wasn't a battle of bullets anymore. It was a battle of gravity. The Americans didn't need to charge, they only needed to keep the iron falling and the pressure rising until the very air became too heavy to breathe. In that moment, a profound change occurred in the unit. It didn't happen because of an order, and it didn't happen because of a breakthrough in the lines. It was a collective, silent realization that rippled through the frozen woods. It was the feeling of a bridge that had been swaying in a gale for weeks finally finding its resting point. That all costs that the voices on the radio demanded had finally met the reality of nothing left to give. Conrad felt a great, heavy sigh escape his own lungs. It wasn't a sigh of defeat, not really. It was a sigh of release. It was the sound of a soul putting down a burden that it was never meant to carry alone. He looked at Hans, and he saw the boy exhale, his shoulders dropping an inch, his face softening into a look of absolute, exhausted peace. They were done. Not with their duty to each other, but with the impossible demand to hold back the tide of history with their bare, freezing hands. The iron had won, and the rain had won, but in their quiet surrender to the reality of their exhaustion, the men had found a strange, final kind of dignity. They were no longer cogs in a great machine, they were just men, tired and cold, waiting for the end of the story. The American advance was felt then not as a threat, but as an inevitability, a closing of a chapter. The pressure reached its peak, and the German line didn't snap like a dry twig, it dissolved like salt in water. Men began to move, not in a panic, but with a slow, methodical grace, gathering their few precious belongings, a letter, a photo, a crust of bread, and beginning the long, staggering walk toward the east. Conrad stood up. His knees protested with a sharp, biting pain, but he ignored it. He reached out a hand and helped Hans to his feet. The boy was so light, so drained of everything but the basic spark of life, that he felt like he might float away into the mist if Conrad let go. "We're going now, Hans," Conrad whispered. "Where?" the boy asked, his voice vacant but calm. "Away from the iron," Conrad said. "Toward the morning." They began to walk, a slow procession of ghosts moving through the shattered timber. They passed the craters where the iron had fallen. They passed the ancient oaks that had been turned into jagged toothpicks. They moved through the freezing rain, which now felt like a baptism, washing away the grime of the trenches. The weight of the forest stayed behind them. The pressure in the air began to lift, as if they were rising from the depths of the ocean toward the surface. Behind them, the American artillery continued its rhythmic pulse, but the sound was growing distant, a fading heartbeat in the dark. Conrad kept his hand on Hans's shoulder, a steadying anchor as they picked their way through the ruins. He thought of his pear trees. He thought of the way the earth would smell in the spring, once the snow had melted and the sun had returned to the valleys. He realized that to survive the weight of iron and rain, one had to eventually let go of the iron and simply become part of the rain, to flow where the earth demanded, to seek the low ground, and to wait for the season to change. As they reached the edge of the deep woods, the sky began to turn a pale, watery silver. The fog was still there, but it was thinner, more translucent. For the first time in weeks, Conrad felt a lightness in his chest. The sigh he had breathed back in the foxhole was still echoing in his spirit, a long, peaceful exhaling of years of tension. They had lost the forest. They had lost the battle. But in the quiet, collective surrender to their own humanity, they had found the strength to simply keep walking. Close your eyes now, and feel the weight of your own day lifting away. Imagine that you are walking out of those dark, heavy woods, leaving the iron and the noise far behind you. The air is growing lighter. The pressure is vanishing. You are moving toward a place of soft light and absolute quiet. Listen to the gentle rhythm of the rain against your window. It is no longer a burden, it is a lullaby, a soft, repetitive sound that tells you the world is being washed clean. Let your shoulders drop. Let your breath go slow and deep. You have carried enough for today. Sleep now, as the gray shadows fade into the peace of the night. Let the memory of the orchard and the pear blossoms fill your mind with a soft, white warmth. You are safe, you are warm, and the morning is waiting for you, just beyond the edge of the trees. Rest your head, and let the quiet night hold you in its gentle, weightless embrace. The snow has a way of softening even the heaviest of departures, turning a long journey into a trail of quiet silver secrets. For weeks, the forest had been a world without an edge, a green and gray labyrinth that seemed to breathe with a heavy, suffocating weight. But tonight, the air feels different. It is thinner, colder, and filled with a profound, hollow silence that was missing in the days of the falling iron. The great pressure from the west has finally pushed through, and the forest, like a tired giant, is finally letting go. The lines have not just broken, they have dissolved into the mist, and the men who remain are no longer defenders of a line, but travelers in the dark, seeking the dawn. We follow a man named Jacob. He is moving slowly, his boots sinking deep into the fresh, powdery snow with a rhythmic, crystalline crunch. But Jacob is not walking alone. Slumped across his back, arms draped heavily over his shoulders, is his friend, Emil. Jacob's world has shrunk to the width of the snowy trail and the steady, warm rhythm of Emil's breath against the back of his neck. It is a heavy burden, a physical weight that pulls at his aching shoulders and makes his knees tremble with every step. But to Jacob, Emil is the only thing that is real. The war, the maps, the lost pillboxes, and the shattered trees have all faded into the white gloom. There is only the weight of a brother, the heat of a life held close, and the long, slow walk toward the east. They move through a forest that has become a graveyard of iron and wood. Abandoned helmets sit like frozen mushrooms in the drifts, their straps trailing in the wind. Empty tins and tattered maps are slowly being buried by the falling flakes, as if the earth is trying to tidy itself, to hide the scars of the autumn. Jacob does not look at these things. He keeps his head down, his chin tucked into the damp wool of his collar, watching his own footprints bloom in the pristine white before him. "Stay with me, Emil," Jacob whispers. His voice is a low, soothing hum, barely louder than the sigh of the wind in the high pines. "Do you hear the snow? It's singing to us. It's telling us that the way is clear." Emil stirs slightly, his head lolling against Jacob's helmet. His voice is thin, a fragile thread of sound that seems to come from a great distance. "Is it far, Jacob? Is the clearing near?" Just over the next ridge, Jacob lies gently. He has said this 4 times already, but the lie is a necessary warmth, a small fire they carry between them. "I can almost smell the open air, Emil. No more pines. No more shadows. Just the wide, open fields, and the road that leads home. Think of the road, Emil. Think of the way the dust used to rise behind the carts in the summer, golden and warm. They pass other shadows in the trees. These are the others, the remnants of a unit that once had names and numbers, now reduced to silent, staggering figures moving in the same direction. There is no shouting, no disorganized panic. There is only a collective, instinctive migration. They move like a flock of birds that has lost its leader but still knows where the sun rises. When they pass each other, they do not speak. They simply offer a slow nod, a shared glance of recognition that says, "You are still here. I am still here." Jacob stops for a moment to catch his breath, leaning his back against the rough, freezing bark of a birch tree. The white bark is peeling in thin, papery strips, fluttering in the breeze like tiny flags of surrender. He adjusts his grip on Emil's legs, feeling the deep, cold ache in his own fingers. His mittens are soaked through, but he doesn't feel the cold anymore, he only feels the responsibility. He looks up through the branches. The sky is a bruised, velvety purple, and the stars are beginning to prick through the thinning clouds. They are bright and cold, like distant diamonds. For the first time in months, Jacob can see the constellations. He finds the great bear, its tail pointing toward the east, toward the Rhine, toward the safety of the distance. "Look at the stars, Emil," he murmurs. "They're guiding us. They've been waiting for us to leave the woods so they could show us the way." Emil opens his eyes, his pale face catching the faint light of the snow. He looks up, and a tiny, fragile smile touches his lips. "They look like the lights in the valley, Jacob. Do you remember? When we would walk down from the hills at night, and the village would be twinkling below us like a handful of fallen stars." "I remember," Jacob says, his voice thick with a sudden, quiet emotion. "I remember the smell of the wood smoke from the chimneys. I remember the way the yellow light would spill out onto the snow from the tavern window. We're going back there, Emil. I promise you. I'm going to carry you all the way to your mother's doorstep, and I'm going to sit by your fire until my boots are dry." Jacob pushes off from the tree, his muscles screaming in protest, but he finds a hidden reservoir of strength. It is the resilience of a man who has nothing left to lose except the person on his back. He continues the climb, his breath coming in long, white plumes. As they ascend the final ridge, the trees begin to thin. The dense, claustrophobic walls of fir and spruce give way to smaller, windswept shrubs. The air grows sharper, more expansive. And then, suddenly, the forest ends. Jacob stops at the crest of the hill. Below them, the land falls away into a wide, rolling valley. The Hürtgen Forest sits behind them like a dark, jagged sea, its shadows deep and terrible. But ahead, the world is open. The fields are covered in a seamless blanket of white, and in the distance, the faint, ghostly outlines of farmhouses and barns stand like quiet sentinels in the moonlight. There is no more artillery here. No more snapping twigs. No more ghostly pressure in the fog. There is only the immense, peaceful sky and the long, white road leading east. Jacob feels a great, heavy sigh escape his lungs, a sound that has been bottled up inside him since the first leaf turned brown in September. He has done it. He has brought his friend out of the dark. "We're out, Emil," he whispers, his voice trembling. "Look. The forest is gone." Emil looks back one last time. He sees the dark tree line silhouetted against the snow, a place that had tried to swallow them whole. He sees the hundreds of other sets of footprints emerging from the woods, all of them converging into a single, worn path in the valley. They are the footprints of men who have survived the impossible, leaving behind the iron and the fire for the quiet promise of the open air. "It looks so small from here," Emil breathes. "It was just a forest, Emil," Jacob says, though they both know that is not true. "Just a forest, and we're leaving it to the snow now." Jacob begins the descent. The walking is easier here, the ground more level. He feels a strange, weightless sensation, as if the forest was a physical anchor that has finally been cut. He is still tired, still hungry, and his feet are still numb, but his heart is light. He is no longer a soldier retreating, he is a man walking home. As they move further into the valley, the footprints behind them begin to fade. The falling snow, gentle and persistent, fills in the deep hollows made by Jacob's boots. It covers the path, smoothing over the evidence of their struggle. Soon, there will be no sign that they were ever there. The forest will hold its secrets, and the snow will hold the silence. But the footprints leading east remain for a while longer, a long, winding thread of human endurance stretching across the white landscape. They are a testament to the quiet, everyday heroism of a man who refused to leave his friend behind. They are the marks of a resilience that is stronger than iron, a kindness that survives the frost. Jacob continues to talk to Emil as they walk. He tells him about the summer, about the taste of cold beer on a hot afternoon, about the sound of a scythe moving through tall grass, about the soft, warm weight of a handmade quilt. He weaves a world of peace out of the cold air, building a future with every word. The night is deep and beautiful. The moon hangs low over the horizon, casting long, blue shadows across the snow. The world is perfectly still, wrapped in a winter lullaby that has no end. Close your eyes now, and imagine that wide, white valley. Feel the crisp, clean air on your face, and the immense, open sky above you. The dark woods are far behind you now, a memory fading into the mist. You are on the open road, and the way is clear. Listen to the rhythmic crunch of the snow beneath your feet. Let it lull you into a state of absolute calm. You are carrying nothing now. The burdens have been laid down. The journey is nearing its end. Feel the warmth of a shared hope, a quiet promise of a home that is waiting just beyond the next rise. Let your breathing slow, matching the peaceful rhythm of the winter night. You are safe, you are free of the shadows, and the stars are watching over you. Sleep now, as the footprints fade into the white. Let the gentle, whispering dark carry you into a rest that is deep, quiet, and entirely full of light. The forest is gone, and the morning is coming. Rest your head, and simply be at peace. In the end, the forest did not close its eyes to the violence, it simply chose to bury the memory beneath a soft, white veil. The snow does not fall in the Hürtgen the way it falls in the open fields. Here, beneath the shattered remains of the great firs, it drifts down in a slow, hypnotic dance, weaving through the jagged branches like a silk thread through a needle. It is a quiet, persistent arrival. It does not rush. It does not roar. It simply begins to exist, one tiny, perfect crystal at a time, settling upon the world until the brown and gray of the war are replaced by a vast, shimmering ocean of white. As the last of the footsteps leading east fade into the distance, a profound and heavy silence settles over the woods. It is a silence so thick you can almost feel it pressing against your skin, like a heavy woolen blanket. The sounds that had defined the autumn, the squelch of boots in the mire, the rhythmic tapping of the rain, the sharp, sudden cracks of artillery, have all been hushed. The snow acts as a grand, impartial insulator, absorbing the echoes of the struggle and replacing them with a peace that feels as ancient as the trees themselves. If you were to wander back through the abandoned positions tonight, you would see a world transformed. The foxholes, those shallow, muddy graves that had held the shivering forms of young men for so long, are being gently filled. The snow rounds off their sharp, jagged edges. It fills the craters until they are nothing more than soft, shallow bowls in the earth. The trenches, once jagged scars cut into the living root system of the woods, are now smooth, white ribbons, winding harmlessly between the trunks. The forest is reclaiming itself. It is covering its wounds with a bandage of ice and lace. In one of these abandoned hollows, tucked beneath the protective overhang of a fallen spruce, a single steel helmet sits half buried in a drift. It is no longer a symbol of iron and defense. Tonight, it is merely a vessel for the snow. A small mound of white has gathered in the curve of the brim, looking for all the world like a sleeping bird. Next to it, a discarded glove, stiff and frozen, lies with its fingers curled, as if still reaching for a warmth that has long since departed. There is a story in these objects, a quiet, melancholic history of the men who are no longer here. They are the ghosts of the Hürtgen, and the snow is the only witness left to their passing. Let us imagine a young man named Karl. He was one of the last to leave this ridge. In the haste of the withdrawal, in the slow, staggering march toward the east, Karl had realized he had left something behind. Not his rifle, not his canteen, but a small, tattered book of poetry that had belonged to his grandfather. It was a tiny thing, bound in fading blue cloth, filled with words about spring meadows and the song of the nightingale. Karl had stopped for a moment, looking back into the darkening woods, his heart pulling him toward the trench. But the snow was already falling heavy, and the officer's hand had been firm on his shoulder. "Keep walking, Karl," the man had whispered. "The forest will keep it for you now." And the forest did. Tonight, that little blue book lies at the bottom of a shallow scrape, covered by a thin, translucent sheet of ice. The snow falls over it, layer by layer, protecting the words from the wind. The poems about the sun and the flowers are being held in the cold, dark heart of the winter, a secret kept between the paper and the earth. This is the mercy of the snow. It does not judge. It does not take sides. It covers the German iron and the American copper with the same impartial grace. It settles over the fallen, those who did not get to walk toward the east, and it wraps them in a shroud of absolute purity. It turns the battlefield into a cathedral of quiet, where the only movement is the slow, rhythmic swaying of the snow-laden branches. The abandoned pillboxes, those heavy concrete monsters that once breathed the scent of damp wool and fear, are now silent. The snow drifts against their iron doors, sealing them shut. The dark slits of the embrasures, which once peered out into the mist with such intensity, are now filled with white, looking like closed eyes. The concrete is cold, but it is no longer a prison. It is just stone again, part of the landscape, slowly being swallowed by the rising white tide. As the night deepens, the temperature drops further, and the air becomes so still that a single falling needle makes a sound like a whispered secret. Somewhere in the deep shadows, a small, handwritten note has been pinned to a tree with a rusted nail. It was left by a medic, a man who had spent his days and nights tending to the broken bodies in the dark. The ink is faded, and the edges of the paper are curled by the frost, but the message remains. It does not speak of victory or loss. It simply says, there is a spring beneath this snow. Do not forget to look for it. The medic is gone now, his footsteps long since filled by the drifts. But his hope remains, pinned to the rough bark of a pine, being slowly encased in a layer of shimmering frost. The snow gathers on the top edge of the paper, forming a tiny, white roof, as if protecting the thought from the weight of the winter. The why of the defeat, the exhaustion of the spirit, the dissolving of the lines, the weight of the iron, feels very far away tonight. In the blanket of white, those reasons are secondary to the profound reality of the silence. The German soldiers lost the forest not just to an enemy, but to the overwhelming, crushing weight of a world that had simply run out of time and warmth. They reached the end of their endurance, and the forest, sensing the shift, finally moved in to finish the story. But there is no anger in the woods tonight. Only a long, slow exhaling of breath. If you listen with your heart, you can hear the forest dreaming. It dreams of the time before the iron came. It dreams of the squirrels gathering nuts in the golden light of October. It dreams of the deep, cool shadows of July. And beneath the snow, deep in the frozen mud, the roots are holding onto each other. They are sharing the memory of the men who sat among them, the boys who shared their bread and wrote their letters in the dark. The forest does not forget. It simply chooses to remember with kindness. The light of the moon reflects off the snow, creating a soft, ambient glow that illuminates the woods from within. The trees look like ghosts, their branches heavy with white sleeves, bowing their heads in a collective prayer. The jagged, splintered trunks, the ancients who wept when the thunder fell, are now beautiful again. The snow has filled the cracks in their bark and capped their broken crowns with shimmering silver. They are no longer ruins, they are sculptures of resilience. A lone fox moves through the clearing, its paws making no sound as it steps over the buried remains of a supply crate. It pauses, its nose twitching in the cold air, looking at the stillness. It sees no enemies here. It sees no lines of defense. It sees only the winter. It trots away, its red tail a brief flash of color in the monochrome world, leaving behind a neat line of prints that the falling snow will erase before the hour is out. This is the ultimate resolution of the Hürtgen. The war has moved on, spilling out into the flatlands and the river valleys beyond. The noise has followed the men. But here, in the heart of the woods, the blanket of white has brought a final, lasting peace. The land is no longer a strategic prize. It is not a boundary or a fortress. It is just the forest again, ancient, silent, and deeply, profoundly still. Let the image of the white wood settle into your mind. See the way the snow clings to the pine needles, turning each branch into a delicate, frozen plume. Feel the absolute quiet of the empty trenches, no longer places of fear, but places of rest. The cold is not an enemy tonight, it is a preserver. It is holding the world in a state of grace, waiting for the cycle to turn. Breathe in the crisp, imagined air of the snowy woods. It is clean and sharp, washing away the dust and the smoke of the day. Feel the heavy, peaceful weight of the winter sky pressing gently down upon you. You are like the little blue book of poetry, held safe in the dark, protected from the wind by a layer of soft, white dreams. The scars are covered. The noise is gone. The forest is sleeping. Close your eyes, and let the rhythmic, silent fall of the snow lull you into a deep and effortless rest. Imagine the white velvet settling over the world, smoothing away the sharp edges of your worries, filling the hollows of your mind with quiet. You are safe in the heart of the winter. The earth is holding you, and the snow is watching over you. Sleep now, in the absolute peace of the blanket of white. Let the shadows fade into the silver light, and let the long, quiet night carry you into a dreamless, beautiful stillness. The forest is at rest, and you may rest with it. The iron heart of the forest has stopped beating, and now there is only the sound of the wind whistling through an open door that was never meant to be left ajar. Deep within the shadowed folds of the Hürtgen, where the pines grow thickest and the earth is forever damp, the great concrete guardians stand in a state of sudden, frozen surprise. These are the pillboxes, the hollow shells of the Siegfried Line, once the pride of an empire's defense. For months, they were the world's most claustrophobic homes, crowded, sweating, and filled with the frantic energy of men trying to stay alive. But tonight, they are something else entirely. They are monuments to a silence that is so profound it feels as heavy as the stone itself. If you were to step off the snowy trail and push through the brittle, frozen ferns, you would find them. They look like ancient gray boulders that have grown eyes. The moss has already begun to crawl up their sides, and the frost has painted delicate, crystalline patterns over the rough-poured cement. To enter one now is to step out of the winter and into a pocket of time that has been perfectly preserved in amber. The heavy steel doors, once bolted and barred against the terrors of the night, now hang loosely on their rusted hinges. They groan softly in the breeze, a low, metallic sigh that echoes through the empty chambers. Inside, the air is perfectly still. It is colder than the air outside, a deep, subterranean chill that smells of wet rock, old iron, and the faint, lingering ghost of wood smoke. This is the architecture of absence. In the pale, winter light that spills through the narrow embrasures, you can see the shapes of the lives that were lived here. There is an empty wooden crate in the corner, its slats silvered by the damp. On top of it sits a small, rusted tin that once held boot polish. It is open, the lid discarded nearby, as if the owner had simply set it down for a moment and intended to return. Nearby, a single, tattered woolen mitten lies on the floor, its thumb tucked inward, looking like a small, blue hand reaching out for a friend who is no longer there. There is a profound, melancholic beauty in these discarded things. They are the small, quiet witnesses to the end of a long and terrible struggle. Let us walk softly down the narrow concrete corridor, where the walls are still damp with the condensation of 1,000 shared breaths. In one of the smaller rooms, where the officers once pored over their neat, blue-lined maps, a single candle stub remains on a ledge. It is a small mound of pale wax, half melted, with a black, charred wick that has been silent for a very long time. Next to it, carved into the soft gray cement of the wall, is a name. Dieter. Just a name, scratched with the tip of a bayonet or a sharpened stone. Beneath the name is a date, and beside it, a small, lopsided heart. Dieter was someone's son. Perhaps he was someone's father, or a brother, or a sweetheart. As he sat in the flickering amber light of that candle, listening to the heavy thunder of the world outside, he reached out and left his mark on the stone. He wanted the concrete to remember that he had been there. He wanted to anchor himself to something solid, something that wouldn't shake or dissolve in the mist. Now, Dieter is gone, swallowed by the long walk toward the east or the quiet peace of the snow, but his name remains, a tiny, defiant echo of a human soul in a room made of iron and shadow. The silence in these bunkers is not an empty thing. It is a full silence, crowded with the memories of whispers and the rhythmic sound of heavy breathing. When the pillboxes were full, the air was thick with the scent of damp wool and the low, murmuring voices of boys telling stories to keep the darkness at bay. They spoke of the smell of harvest festivals, the sound of a mother's voice calling them in for dinner, the feel of a soft bed after a long day of work. They built invisible cathedrals of hope within these gray walls. But now, the stories have all been told. The voices have drifted out through the gun slits, carried away by the winter wind, leaving behind only the cold and different stone. Defeat, we are learning, does not always sound like a crash. Often, it sounds like an empty room. It is the sound of a single drop of water falling from the ceiling, hitting the concrete floor with a hollow plink that rings through the stillness. It is the sound of the wind brushing against a discarded piece of paper, a letter that was never finished, perhaps, its ink now blurred by the damp until the words look like the shadows of clouds. To stand in the center of an empty pillbox is to feel the immense, crushing weight of the no longer. No longer occupied. No longer defended. No longer needed. There is a strange, quiet relief in this emptiness. For the first time in many years, these structures are no longer tools of war. They are just rooms. The concrete, which was poured with such frantic intensity, can finally relax. It no longer has to hold back the iron. It no longer has to be a fortress. It can simply be a shelter for the small things of the forest. In the corner of the main chamber, beneath the heavy ventilation pipe, a small field mouse has built a nest. It is made of shredded scraps of a gray woolen blanket and the dried, brown needles of a fir tree. The mouse moves with a soft, scuttling sound, entirely unaware of the history of the walls around it. To the mouse, the pillbox is not a symbol of defeat or the end of a line. It is just a dry, safe place to sleep through the winter. It is a place where the frost cannot reach, a sanctuary provided by the very stone that was built for destruction. Nature is a slow and patient healer. It does not argue with the concrete, it simply absorbs it. Already, the roots of a giant oak are beginning to press against the outer walls of the bunker. They move with a quiet, irresistible strength, finding the tiny cracks in the cement, widening them millimeter by millimeter over the years. Eventually, the forest will win. The concrete will crumble, the steel will rust into orange dust, and the pillboxes will become nothing more than gentle mounds of earth where the wild berries grow. But for now, they remain as they are, the empty pillboxes of the Hürtgen. As you stand in the doorway, looking back into the dark interior, you can feel the profound sadness of the place, but also a sense of closure. The struggle that once defined these hills has moved on. The fear that once lived in these rooms has evaporated. What is left is a quiet, contemplative space where the forest is slowly whispering its secrets to the stone. The defeat was not just a loss of territory, it was a surrender to the inevitable. The boys in the gray coach realized that the concrete could not save them from the weight of time and the exhaustion of the heart. They left these rooms behind not because they were cowards, but because they were human, and they had reached the end of what a human being can endure in the dark. As they stepped out of these heavy doors for the last time, they must have felt a strange, dizzying sense of freedom. They were leaving the safety of the stone for the uncertainty of the open air, but they were also leaving behind the suffocating weight of the defense. They were walking toward the morning, leaving the echoes to keep watch over the empty chambers. The winter light is beginning to fade now, turning the gray concrete to a deep, charcoal blue. The shadows in the corners are lengthening, reaching out to touch the discarded mitten and the empty tin. The silence deepens, becoming a velvet cloak that wraps around the memory of Dieter and all the others. Outside, the snow continues to fall, a gentle, white curtain that hides the bunkers from the world. It drifts against the open doors, slowly sealing the entrance with a soft, cold wall of purity. The forest is putting its fortresses to bed. Listen to the stillness. Let the absolute, echoing quiet of the empty pillbox settle into your own spirit. There is no need for noise here. There is no need for maps or strategies. There is only the peace of a journey that has reached its end. Feel the cool, steady air of the stone room and let it calm your mind. The walls are thick and the world is far away. Like the little field mouse in the corner, you can find a safe place here, tucked away from the wind and the storm. Release the tensions of the day. Let your worries fall away, one by one, like the water droplets hitting the concrete floor. Plink. 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 Every sound is a step toward a deeper rest. The bunkers are empty, and the war is over in these woods. What remains is only the earth, the trees, and the quiet resilience of the things that grow in the dark. Close your eyes, and let the long, echoing silence carry you into a sleep that is as deep as the stone and as quiet as the falling snow. You are safe, you are still, and the forest is watching over the memories. Rest now, in the shadow of the ancients, and let the gentle night hold you in its heavy, peaceful embrace. Beneath the deep silence of the snow, the earth is already beginning to dream of the light. The winter in the Hürtgen has always been a season of heavy secrets, but even the longest night eventually yields to the persistent, gentle pressure of the sun. As the iron-gray clouds of the new year begin to fray at the edges, revealing glimpses of a pale, watery blue, the forest starts to wake. It is a slow, rhythmic awakening. It begins not with a shout, but with a single, clear drop of meltwater falling from the tip of a pine needle, landing softly on the white shroud below. Soon, that single drop is joined by millions of others. The blanket of white that held the woods in a state of grace for so long begins to thin and weep. The sound of the forest changes once more. The hushed, insulated silence of the deep winter is replaced by the musical, trickling song of 1,000 tiny streams. They run over the frozen mud, dancing around the roots of the ancient oaks, carrying away the grit and the sorrow of the darker months. As the snow recedes, the earth is revealed. It is a scarred earth, yes. It is an earth that has been churned, broken, and filled with the remnants of a struggle that the trees are already beginning to forget. But the forest floor is not a graveyard, it is a cradle. If you were to look closely at the places where the boys once huddled, where Johannes wrote his letter to his little sister, and where Wilhelm watched the snowflake smudge his name, you would see that the healing has already begun. The deep, jagged craters are no longer stark and raw. They have become small, sheltered basins where the first green shoots of the wild garlic and wood anemone are pushing through the dark soil. The mud that once held the soldiers so tightly, that threatened to swallow them whole, is now soft and fertile, ready to nourish the next generation of life. The forest has a remarkable way of absorbing the iron and the fire. The discarded helmets, the rusted tins, and the fragments of shattered timber are not being pushed away. They are being invited in. Over the years, the moss, that thick, velvety carpet of emerald and lime, will crawl over the cold steel of the abandoned pillboxes. It will wrap its soft fingers around the rusted hinges and fill the cracks in the concrete with tiny, star-shaped flowers. The roots of the giant firs, those ancient guardians that witnessed everything, will reach down into the foxholes. They will encounter a button from an oversized coat, a small piece of river glass, or the remains of a letter that was never sent. The roots do not judge these things. They do not see them as symbols of defeat or victory. To the trees, these are simply part of the earth's story now. They wrap around the iron, weaving it into their own strength. They draw the salt and the minerals from the artifacts, turning the sorrow of the past into the leaves of the future. In the Hürtgen, the memory of the boys who never left is literally being woven into the canopy. When the wind moves through the high branches, it is carrying the breath of 1,000 quiet stories. Let us think of the boys one last time. Not as soldiers in a failing line, but as children of the earth who have finally found their rest. The forest holds them with a profound, maternal kindness. The boy who shared his last crust of bread is now part of the soil that feeds the deer in the early morning mist. The veteran who taught a teenager how to button his collar has become part of the steady strength of the oak. The fear, the cold, and the crushing weight of the iron have all been filtered through the roots and the rain, leaving behind only a quiet, enduring peace. There is a beautiful resilience in this cycle. The world of maps and borders, of strategies and losses, is a world of the surface. It is a world of noise. But beneath the surface, in the dark, cool realm of the roots, there is a different kind of history. It is a history of connection. It is a history that remembers the touch of a hand on a trunk, the sound of a whispered lullaby, and the warmth of a shared huddle in the dark. The forest remembers what the people sometimes forget, that we are all, in the end, made of the same stardust and soil. As the spring finally takes hold, the Hürtgen becomes a place of immense, quiet beauty. The light filters through the new leaves, painting the forest floor in dapples of gold and shadow. The birds return to the branches, their songs filling the cathedral of the pines with a music that has no memory of the artillery. The ravines, once traps of isolation and darkness, are now lush galleries of ferns and rushing water. If you were to walk these paths today, you might still find a piece of the story. You might find a rusted buckle or a fragment of a blue-tinted bottle half buried in the moss. But you would not feel the weight of the war. You would feel the immense, calming pressure of the time that has passed. You would feel the silence of the forest, which is not an empty silence, but a full one, a silence that has listened to everything and decided to offer only peace in return. The complete history of why the battle was lost is ultimately written in the trees. It was lost because the winter was too long. It was lost because the iron was too heavy. It was lost because the human heart, as resilient as it is, eventually needs to return to the light. The German soldiers didn't just lose a forest, they were reclaimed by one. They were surrendered back to the ancient, indifferent, and ultimately merciful rhythm of the natural world. The passage of time is like the falling of the snow. It smooths the edges, it fills the hollows, and it turns the jagged into the graceful. The Hürtgen is no longer a wound on the map. It is a living monument to the quiet endurance of the spirit and the healing power of the earth. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, imagine yourself standing at the edge of this forest. The air is warm, smelling of pine resin, damp earth, and the sweet promise of blooming flowers. The shadows are long and soft, stretching across a floor that is once again a carpet of soft, green moss. Listen to the heartbeat of the woods. It is a slow, deep thrum, the sound of the roots holding the earth together. Feel the immense, protective presence of the trees, standing tall in the fading light. They are the keepers of the secrets, the guardians of the memories, and they are at peace. Every story has found its place. Every letter has been read by the rain. Every boy has been tucked in by the roots. Release the weight of your own history. Let the worries of your day be absorbed into the soft, welcoming earth. You are part of the cycle, too, a thread in the great, weaving story of the light and the dark. There is no need to hold on so tightly. The forest is here to hold you. Close your eyes and breathe in the scent of the healing woods. Let the rhythmic swaying of the branches high above lull you into a state of absolute, effortless rest. The winter is over, the iron has turned to dust, and the morning is coming, bringing with it a world that is green, vibrant, and entirely new. Sleep now, in the arms of the ancients. Let the quiet memory of the boys who never left be a gentle light in the back of your mind, a reminder that even in the deepest shadows, we are never truly alone. Rest your head, and let the long, peaceful night carry you into the dreaming heart of the forest. All is well. All is quiet. All is forgiven.